take that as an opportunity for you to come and put your views and proposals across to us as Parliament. By so doing, honorable members, let me take this opportunity to officially declare the meeting open, but I will do so also by just introducing myself for those that have not actually had an opportunity to interact with me or us as a committee. My name is Dikgang Stock. I'm actually chairing the ad hoc of this particular bill, party political funding bill. So I will just briefly give over also to honorable members, just briefly to introduce yourself and then also the province that you are representing, so that the different stakeholders can also have an appreciation of who is in the meeting and which provinces are represented. And then once they are done, we'll also move to those that are going to present to us today, just to introduce themselves when they'll be starting with their presentation. So I will actually start on my left-hand side, on my far left. Honorable Nita, over to you.
Good afternoon. I'm Zukiswa Nita. I'm the member of the ad hoc committee from Eastern Cape.
Good afternoon. My name is Mutalane Divet Monakedi. I am a member of this committee representing in the NSOP Limpopo. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kathy Lamini, member of this ad hoc committee. Mpumalanga is my beautiful province. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Tekoitile Motlashuping. I'm from the Northwest Province.
Next one.
Oh, thank you, Chair. My name is Makosini Shabangu, a member of the ad hoc committee. I come from Free State. I think every picture tells a story. That's English.
Good afternoon, I'm Kathy Labuskachni. I'm a member of the ad hoc committee and I am representing the Western Cape.
Okay, those were the introductions from all honorable members that are here. We've got also members of the parliamentary staff. Can we also give them an opportunity to introduce themselves?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Estelle Grunewald. I'm the committee secretary.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Michael Prince. I'm with Parliament's Legal Services.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Buiselo Samuel Shekiso, a researcher of the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I am Mongana Tau, the unit manager in committees.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Arutungwandla, committee assistant.
Okay, no, I think we're done now with the introduction. So I'll just make a plea that for those that will be actually making oral submissions or presentations, they will get an opportunity to introduce themselves before they do the presentation. So I'm just going to request that we now proceed with our scheduled agenda for today's meeting. But before we do that, honorable members, I think I must just indicate one thing. In the email that was sent to all the different stakeholders that are supposed to present to us today, I think we did indicate in the email that per presentation, we are requesting that you prepare a presentation for not more than 20 minutes that will be presented to us. Now, as a committee, we also had an opportunity the last week when we sat as a committee, we had an opportunity to also agree on the approach for the public hearing. And there are two issues that I need to indicate, which I think they are of paramount importance to people that will be presenting to take note of. we have agreed that we are going to allocate 30 minutes per presentation. Now, the 30 minutes is actually 15 minutes to be allocated to the presentation itself. And then the 15 minutes will be allocated to the clarity-seeking questions based on the presentation. Because as members of the ad hoc committee, we also had an opportunity to go through some of the presentations. And then we are going again sometime next week as a committee. We are going to get an opportunity to go through the deliberations ourselves as a committee. So we thought we don't have, to prolong the presentations or the public hearing for quite too long, because we are still going to have an opportunity ourselves to deliberate on the presentation. So we'll have to allocate 30 minutes per presentation. If you out of the 30 minutes, if we are going to use 20 minutes, then we'll be left with 10 minutes for clarity-seeking question in your presentation. And if you exceed the 20 minutes mark, then we'll actually request you to take note of the time and all of that. So I think that's the approach that we are going to take moving forward, honorable members. I don't know whether we are in agreement. I can see most of the members are actually in agreement of that particular reality, and that we must actually stick to the approach that we agreed upon. Now, all of us, I think we've got agendas in front of us based on how we are going to proceed. I think we've got eight presentations that we're going to receive. And in the first presentation, it's from the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. It's CASAC. And in that presentation will be done by Professor Richard Calland or either Ms. Motlati Komote. So we'll now take the opportunity to give over to CASAC to take us through the presentation. I'm not sure whether you want to present from where you are sitting or you'll be comfortable to come and sit next to us here. If you want to present from there, then that's fine. Okay, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much indeed. I'm very comfortable sitting here. It's a place I've sat before. It feels relatively at home. And the advantage is that one can look directly across at the members of the committee. So with your leave, Chair, I'll remain seated here. Can I begin just by introducing myself and my colleagues, the team here from CASAC. For those of you who are not familiar with the organization CASAC, the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, is a public interest NGO that was founded in 2010 with the express purpose and mandate to support the Constitution and the philosophy of progressive constitutionalism that lies, we say, behind the Constitution by acts of litigation, advocacy, and research. And this particular piece of work, which touches on some of the core values that underpin our Constitution, such as responsiveness and transparency and multi-party democracy, is, we say, a very important issue of constitutionalism for the country. And we have therefore committed resources to conducting research, comparative research. We presented Mr. Law, who's sitting next to me, a researcher that was assigned with this task, presented a compendium of comparative research about other acts of Parliament around the world to the National Assembly Committee in order to assist them in considering the options available to South Africa. So I am a member of the Advisory Council of CASAC. It's an advisory council of volunteers such as myself. There are over 40 eminent South African citizens on that council, plus myself. We serve in order to pursue the mandate of the organization. The reason I'm sitting here, not one of the others, is because this is a subject that has been of very great interest to me for a very long period of time. Indeed, since the late 90s, I have worked on this subject. I used to work for an organization called IDASA, and we conducted a considerable amount of research and litigation on this subject. We never were successful in persuading everybody that this was a matter that should reach the statute book. And so therefore, personally, this is a very, very significant moment in I think, the country's democratic constitutional journey, because it's such an important piece of legislation. I said I was going to, Mr. Chair, introduce the other members of the team. As you mentioned, Motlatsi Komoto, sitting behind me. She's not here to present. She, in fact, is our campaigns officer. So although we have no PowerPoint presentation, and we are doing this entirely old school, she is the new school member of the team because she will be tweeting throughout today's proceedings in order to bring these proceedings and others' perspectives to public light. And then I've mentioned Mr. Law. Mike Law is the researcher that has assisted CASAC during this process, and he's devoted very many long hours and nights during the National Assembly process in order to support not just CASAC, but where possible, the committee itself by doing the sort of comparative and other legal research that I mentioned. Finally, I should just apologize on behalf of Mr. Lawson Naidu, who is the Executive Director of CASAC. He has presented on behalf with me before on behalf of CASAC, but he is otherwise engaged today in Durban on a long-standing commitment that he had in Durban, so hence it's in our hands. The first substantive submission, having got those preliminaries out of the way that I wanted to make to the committee, was to applaud the parliamentary process that has proceeded today and which has brought us to this point. Those of us who work in civil society spend a great deal of our time complaining about things, Mr. Chairman, and often that feels like that's all we ever do. So when we get an opportunity to pass favourable comment, and when we get the opportunity to commend an institution such as Parliament for its exemplary conducting of proceedings such as this, then it's an opportunity that we should not let go by. And so I want to say on the record that CASAC has been full of admiration for the way in which the National Assembly ad hoc committee went about its business. As you know, members of the committee, they spent a lot of time on this piece of legislation. There were 2 opportunities to make submissions. Numerous days and nights were spent chewing over the substantive issues that lay behind this work. And the committee and its chairman, Mr. Vincent Smith, Honourable Smith, could not have been more courteous, more open to submissions from the public. And if anybody from anywhere around the world wanted to look at a parliamentary process and say, well, this is exemplary, it's staying loyal to the principle of participatory democracy that underlies the Constitution, then they need look no further than this particular process. That brings me then to my second substantive point, which is really about how this committee, the NCOP committee, should go about its work and perform its responsibility, its mandate on this occasion. You, of course, Mr. Chairman, have full authority to look at this bill and say, well, it's not perfect. It could be improved in certain respects. And I know that some of the people that will be making submissions after me will be trying to persuade you that you should reopen some of the issues of substance that were debated at great length in the National Assembly. I would encourage you, of course, because it's your responsibility to do so, to look very carefully at all of the issues that come before you, to look at every clause of this draft bill. But having said that, I would also invite you, and this is our primary submission, I would also invite you to say, well, this is a bill that advances the principle of transparency and openness and multi-party democracy so far and in such a substantial fashion that, in fact, it should proceed without amendment. Now, there is perhaps some argument that if one takes the long view of life, and I've had to take the long view over this issue, as I said, I've been working for 20 years on it, and necessarily have had to take the long view. Why the urgency? Well, there is inevitably going to be a general election in the next 12 months or so. That is therefore the campaign season. We think it important that this bill be passed before that campaign season commences. And we think therefore there is a degree of legitimate urgency to ensuring that the passage of this bill proceeds without any undue delay. So we would invite you therefore to take account of that when deciding whether or not to reopen issues of complexity that have already, as I mentioned at least once before, already been the subject of intense discussion, debate, negotiation and research in the National Assembly Committee. That is our opening point. Having said all of that, if, Mr. Chairman, you get to the point at which you decide, well, there are one or two issues, and of course, no piece of legislation is ever perfect. It's very difficult to imagine, especially a piece of legislation such as this, that traverses such difficult territory in many respects, and which tries to deal with what in the literature, the academic literature, says is a wicked problem. And I'm drawing here on my position as an academic at the University of Cape Town to draw upon what I've learned from studying this subject over 20 years, that it is a very difficult topic to legislate effectively over. With that in mind, I set, and Mr. Naidu set Mr. Law a new task in recent days and weeks. We asked him to go back to this bill, look at it as far as possible with fresh eyes, and to redo his comparative study as if this bill that is before you today was already an Act of Parliament, and to answer the question, where would this Act of Parliament, if it was an Act of Parliament, where would it sit in the range of over 100 other countries that have such pieces of legislation? And applying the principles and standards which informed our submission when we first made our first submission to the National Assembly Committee, this bill passes all of the tests that we believe are crucial to having an effective piece of legislation. In fact, Mr. Law's conclusion when he reported back to us was that this draft bill, if it was to become law, would sit probably not just in the top 10, but possibly in the top 3 or 4 pieces of law that have reached the statute book around the world. In other words, this will be a piece of law that this country can be rightly proud of as and when it becomes law. To give you one example of that sophistication with which this legislation approaches this difficult topic, it introduces what has become known as a dual disclosure regime. You'll appreciate, obviously, that every donation, there is a donor and a donee. And that where corruption, as it has unfortunately in this country and in many other countries, where corruption or undue influence arises from that relationship between the donor and the donee, then often it is the responsibility, the culpability for that corruption lies on both parties and not just the recipient political party. That is why we thought it was tremendously important to recognize the shared responsibility that the donor and the donee have in order to introduce an effective regime of governance based on principles of transparency and accountability. That is why, therefore, this dual disclosure regime places a burden on, in particular, corporate donors who are seeking to influence or support the political system, the multi-party democracy of this country. It places a burden upon them to report just as much as it does the recipient political party. That is an extraordinarily advanced, sophisticated, and we would say progressive position to take on this issue. And very few other countries have gone that far. And that is why, and one of the reasons why, if this, as and when this law becomes this bill becomes an Act of Parliament, it is something that the country will be able to rely on and be very proud of. Two other minor points before I stop talking, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, the establishment of the new Multi-Party Democracy Fund is an important institutional innovation, particularly because it will allow donors who wish to remain anonymous to make contributions to multi-party democracy. And I'm mentioning this because I know that at least one of the other submissions this afternoon will seek to persuade you that anonymous donations should not be treated in this way. They should be treated differently. With respect, that misses the point. The point, Mr. Chairman, is this, there are some people out there who not only wish to contribute donations to political parties entirely innocently, entirely out of good faith, entirely not because they want to gain any benefit themselves, but because they want to support the system of multi-party democracy. So modest are they in their desire to make that contribution. They don't even want their identity to be known to those that receive their money. But the problem with anonymous donations is, of course, that they're difficult to govern because by their nature, their inherent nature. What this system would create is a system by which the fund, the Multi-Party Democracy Fund, would receive those anonymous donations. Of course, they would not be entirely anonymous because the fund itself, those that run the fund, would know who the donor is. But the political parties that would then benefit from those funds, coming through that fund, would not know the identity. And that would create an entirely arm's-length relationship between the donor and the recipient that we think will benefit political parties because it will bring into the game, it will bring into the funding arena donors who simply do not want their identity known publicly and who are modest enough and humble enough to simply want to make their contributions to support multi-party democracy as a system. Lastly, if you do decide that it is appropriate to amend this bill and put forward amendments that would require the attention once again of the National Assembly, then we would say that the formula, as it's known, the Section 236 formula, the formula for public funding that finds expression through the Act, the Public Funding Act, needs further attention. We think that the proposal of a split between, what's the new split? 2/3 and 1/3, thank you. The new proposed split, 2/3 and 1/3, is a great improvement on the current split of 90 proportional, 10 equitable, which, to be perfectly frank with you, as a constitutional lawyer, I've always thought was unconstitutional, that it cannot have been the intention of the writers of the Constitution in Section 236, where it says that public funding should be on the basis of two principles, equity and proportionality. It cannot have been the Constitutional Assembly's intention that the two principles should be shared out so unevenly, 90% and 10%. Of course, there's silence as to the right proportions, and 2/3, 1/3, we would say is a great improvement. But if it does come to be reopened as a topic, we would advance, as we did in the National Assembly, the proposition that an even split of 50-50 should be the appropriate split. Absolutely, lastly, Mr. Chairman, in the same vein, if you do decide to amend some provisions and send it back to the NA, then we would say that the proposed threshold of 100,000, which is in the regulations attached to the Act, of 100,000 being the figure to trigger disclosure, we think is a little bit on the high side. Of course, size is very much in the eye of the beholder, so to speak, and it does really rather depend who it is that's receiving. So if you're the DA or the ANC, 100,000 might not seem such a large amount. But with respect, if you're a smaller party, 100,000 may, in fact, or 99,000, which would be under the proposed threshold, may in fact be a sizable donation, which could exercise real influence, or it could procure for the donor real influence on that political party. And the whole purpose of this legislation is to ensure that that relationship sees the light of day. And therefore, we would say that 50,000 would be a more appropriate figure. But that's a detail, Mr. Chairman. The short point, to conclude where I began, is that this is an excellent piece of legislation that is the product of an excellent parliamentary process, and we would invite you to say, yes, this is a major advance and it should proceed to the statute book without further delay. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for the presentation from CASAC. We really take note of the presentation. And I like the point which you were actually emphasizing, the relevance of the bill in terms of promoting accountability and also transparency. I think that's actually the objective of the bill, of what the bill seeks to achieve. because, and also we went further to actually outline the relationship between the donor and the donee, which is actually very much important for me. So we take note of the presentation. So let's now give over and open up to clarity-seeking questions so that we can clarify certain aspects of the presentation if there are any. So I've noted Honorable Labaskachny. Over to you, Honorable Labaskachny. Honorable Chabangu will be the next one.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you very much for the presentation. I just want to ask a few clarity questions. There was an argument previously in the portfolio committee stage that the public was allowed, nobody stops them, to donate or to make donations to the fund that existed previously, but no one made any donations to that fund. The mere fact that we are establishing now a multi-party democracy fund, we're not sure whether people will really make use of this donation, although we think that is the right way to go, and so. Now that brings me to your interpretation and your explanation of the 50-50%, and you used the example of saying when a donor doesn't want to make known that he is donating money to a party, and I understand that. Now I want also to say that very often an organization or an individual is known to the party, and because he is known to the party, because he underscribes the values and principles and what the party stands for, just because of that, that organization or person wants to make a donation to that party. And according to this law now, they can either say, I keep quiet, or I want to disclose, or I don't want to disclose. In the light of that, now we also look at what Section 236 said about equity and proportionality. But I want to raise the question now, because I don't know, where does this fit in? How do we go about the fairness of the freedom of choice of association for the donor? Although we say we want to establish a multi-party democracy, this actually means if we go for the 50-50%, it means if I really underscribe one party's values and principles, 50% of the money that I'm going to give to that party is going to some other parties that I really don't subscribe to. Can you give me some clarity on that point of view? Thank you.
Thanks, Honorable Member, Honorable Chabangu and Honorable Dlamini.
Thank you for the presentation. Part of my question has already been dealt with. But I think transparency should play a crucial role. CASAC says they do not want to gain anything. But I think there is no smoke without fire. And if they donate, I would suggest that, unlike what has been said by the latter speaker, they must donate equally to all parties, even if they are smaller than a party. That is my take. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honorable Dlamini. I think will be the last one.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Let me welcome the presentation. Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Let me welcome the presentation. I don't know what I want to say, very progressive. And just one question from my side. I know that we're still going to have an opportunity to get deeper as a committee on these inputs. If we are to promote democracy, definitely small parties don't want to stay small. They will want to grow. What informs, you did explain, but based on what I'm saying to you now, what informs the proposal should we decide to open it up? What informs the proposal to lower it down to 50 instead of 100? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Dlamini. Let's give to CASAC now to clarify the few issues and then we move forward. Over to you, sir. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Law will deal with the first two questions. I just want to respond immediately to the Honourable Dlamini's question. What informs our suggestion that 100,000 is a bit on the high side? Yet we certainly don't wish to create a chilling effect on any party's ability to raise money. We recognise, and there's something that informs our approach, and I believe is perhaps somewhat distinctive to other organisations' approach. We believe political parties, to flourish, to be successful, need the resources, like any organisation, to be able to be effective. The question is, how do you ensure that the money raised does not offend the principle of transparency, where the public have a right to know and understand the relationship between the donor and the donee? We've had ample experience, unfortunately, in recent years in this country of how secret, illicit, badly intended financial relationships can cause democratic entities to be captured. Let me use the word. And party funding has always, throughout the world, had the potential to enable secret, badly intended donors to capture a political party and through that to exercise undue, badly intended influence on the political system as a whole and to undermine its integrity. So that's the as us lawyers put it, that's the mischief that this legislation is seeking to address. And the question is whether a 99,000 rand donation to a small party that has a modest budget would offend the principle of transparency and undue influence. And it's very unlikely that a 99,000 rand donation to the ANC or to the DA, which, as I understand it, are parties with bigger budgets than others, it's unlikely that that 99,000 rand donation will buy the donor secret influence over the party. But a smaller party with a more modest budget, it could do. And it's not a perfect science, this. It's a bit of a thumbsuck for Parliament and for us as to what the right figure is. But we just feel that 100,000 is a bit on the high side, and we would, if you open it up again, we would suggest 50,000. Let me hand over to Mr. Law to deal with the first two questions, if I may, because they go to the legislative scheme as a whole, and he understands it certainly better than I do, and probably better than most.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chairperson, Honourable Members. In order to try and answer the first two questions, what I want to do is take a step back and try compartmentalise the bill somewhat, especially the donations aspect. So to do that, we're going to put it into two categories, and the second one's going to have two sort of subcategories. The first is public funding. That's where we get Section 236, and from Section 236 we have what is now, as it still stands, the Public Funding of Represented Political Parties Act. And yes, absolutely, in that act, it does make provision that private donors can donate to that fund, and it gets split also at the moment in the 90-10 manner. And it is true that that has had very, very little support, if any. What's different now? Well, the first difference, or the main difference, is that previously you could donate anonymously directly to political parties. Now you can't do that. So that's where the rationale all of a sudden for this donations to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund comes in, is now they have no alternative. If they want to make an anonymous donation, it has to go to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. Anyway, I've skipped ahead of myself. So we have the public funding, which is Section 236, and then we have private funding. Now, with private funding, there's two subcategories. There's anonymous donations and donations that are made public. Now, when you want to donate to a political party, you've got a decision to make. Either you are prepared to disclose your identity, and then you can donate directly to a political party. But if you want to keep your anonymity, which we are arguing is not in the spirit of a transparent and accountable constitution, to have undisclosed funders donating to political parties, then you can still donate, but you have a trade-off. Some of your donation is going to go to other parties. So if you want to avoid that, fine, disclose. So we mustn't conflate those three separate areas. Public funding is from the public purse. Private funding is either directly to parties or to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. Is it a violation of the freedom of expression of the donor, and the privacy of the donor? We've always said that, yes, it does infringe that. But the Constitution makes provision that rights can be infringed, and they may also, that infringement may be justified applying a basic proportionality test. We have always maintained that the interest of a transparent, accountable South Africa that has for so many years been crippled by corruption or at least secrecy, those interests outweigh the private interest of an individual donor who can still donate to a political party but must either disclose their identity or donate to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund when everyone gets a split. So it's a trade-off. You have to make a decision. If you want to donate anonymously, fine, but you're going to have to donate to everyone as a whole.
No, thank you very much for that clarity. I think now we have actually covered the whole presentation. We are much clearer on the presentation itself. So we are actually taking note of the views or the proposals from CASAC. Like what if I understood you correctly, Mr. Lawson, we are actually saying the relationship between the donor and the donee, based on the principle of transparency or the right of the donee and the donor to be infringed. You need to make a choice as a donor, whether you want to be known to be supporting a particular party, and if you don't want to be known, you've got also a right to remain and not to fund any political party. I think we actually take note of some of those issues. And then we even went further to actually explain the role between the donor and the donee as it relates to the principle of accountability and also the capturing of some political parties and all of that, you know. So I think we really appreciate it. It was quite comprehensive. So we're much clearer. So we take note, including the fact that you are actually making a proposal to release the 100,000 minimum for a declaration to the IEC. You want it to be a bit released. So we actually take note of all those issues that you raised. We'll also have an opportunity as a committee to go through in detail to some of the other issues. And then at a later stage, our position or a view as a committee will be known at a later stage. So thank you very much for that presentation. We now move...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move over to the next presentation by the South African National Editors Forum, SANEF and AmaBhungane Center for Investigative Journalism. I think it will be done by Ms. Karabo Rajwili and Mr. Isaac Minara. Thank you very much. Over to you. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Honourable Chair and Honourable Members. Thank you for the opportunity. You already stated our name, so we'll jump right in. I'm here on behalf of the South African National Editors Forum. The people on the screen are the people who sent me, and I also convey the greetings of our management committee and Chair Mahlatsi Mahlase. SANEF is a non-profit organization in existence for more than 20 years of editors, senior journalists, journalism trainers, representing the broad South African media, national and community media. We're championing the hard-won freedom of expression legislation, and we also promoting quality, ethics and diversity in the South African media. And we campaign for legislation to enable the media to do their jobs, meaning to do our jobs we need to be able to access information regularly with as much disclosure as possible. So our presentations to the National Assembly and today, it deals mainly with the issues related to the availability of information, and we're not going into the details of how much money and all those kinds of issues. So I'm handing over to Karabo Rajuli to continue, and I'll come back for the second part of the presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Honourable Chair and members. My name is Karabo, and I'm from AmaBhungane, the Centre for Investigative Journalism, and I'm the advocacy coordinator there. AmaBhungane was formed in 2009 as an independent non-profit media company to develop investigative journalism in order to build our democracy. So as our name says, we are, I suppose you could call us dirt specialists because we dig up dirt, but not with the intention of being salacious, but so that we can ensure that the accountability gap in our democracy is closed. Our submission is part of our advocacy mandate, which is to ensure that our reporters have got the information which they need in order to undertake the investigative work, but also in the wider public interest. So we want to ensure that the public is able to realize their constitutional right to know. Some of our reporting has led to really important exposés for our democracy, including the work around state capture. And although we are quite small in size, next slide. Although we're quite small in size, of a team of only 11 individuals, our reach is much greater than our size, as we publish through different media companies, as well as intervene in a variety of legislative matters. We've intervened in legislation such as the Companies Act to ensure there are adequate transparency provisions for companies, as well as in the Protection of State Information Bill to ensure that journalists would not be unduly harmed by their rights being infringed. We have also, as SANEF and AmaBhungane, have participated in the National Assembly process, and we, like CASAC, would like to really applaud the work of Parliament in moving to implement what is probably the most important piece of legislation that our democracy will see, given the egregious effect of money in politics, both pre-94 as well as after 94 in our democracy. However, we are making further submissions on clauses which we think will be of importance for the committee to identify and address if we want to create the kind of legislation which will truly fulfill the intentions of this bill, which is to ensure that the public's right to know is not infringed by secret donors giving money to political parties. And there are significant gaps, and so we disagree somewhat with the previous presenters. We make our submissions not only to ensure that reporters are able to do their work and undertake important investigative stories, but also to ensure that the transparency provisions will allow Parliament, as well as the IEC, to undertake its job correctly and with enough compliance and accountability. Our work, as I've said before, and I won't go into too much detail, is informed by the very investigations that we've undertaken. And so we've been able to identify the specific information gaps, which, one, prevent us from being able to report adequately, but more significantly are the places where corruption is most likely to occur. As I've said before, we are dirt specialists. Our submission addresses 4 areas in particular. We look firstly at around the disclosures of the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. We look specifically at one of the gaps from the National Assembly process around donations in kind and the kinds of disclosures that are required there. We also raise concerns which were raised during the National Assembly process around party business ventures not being either prohibited or subject to a disclosure regime. And we also then look at what we think is crucial for this bill, adequate provisions whereby the IEC as well as Parliament will be able to hold political parties to account should they violate any of the provisions in this bill. And we look at how to better strengthen these in the interest of this bill. To go to the first area of concern for us, the Multi-Party Democracy Fund is an important intervention for this bill, which does allow donors an alternative route to give to parties. And while some distance is created between the donor and the political party of choice by having this alternative avenue, the risk still remains because there's simply no possible disclosure mechanism to the public or to the media, who are best placed to be able to report on possible corruption and undue influence. We therefore would say to this committee that it's crucial to have some measure of disclosure around the Multi-Party Democracy Fund to prevent any possible undue influence. For example, a donor at the provincial level saying to a party, I'm willing to contribute to this fund, knowing full well that some of the donation will go to other political parties. However, their party of choice will still benefit from this Multi-Party Democracy Fund through the current distribution and allocation of funding in the current regulations. Because of this risk, we say that there should be an amendment, if you could go to the next slide, which both allows some level of anonymity for lower threshold donations, but then donations over above prescribed threshold must be disclosed by the IEC to Parliament as well as to the public to again prevent this possible undue influence of private donors using this as an alternative mechanism to capture their party of choice. Our next submission is on public donations, on the disclosures of donations in kind. Whilst this is not a monetary donation to a political party, donations in kind may be things such as voluntary accounting services, management fees, public relations services, and the quantity, the value, the monetary value of this can be significant for a political party and their ability to influence an election and yield power. The unintended consequence of this, the donations in kind not being subject to any kind of public disclosure regime, can be that a donor may choose to use this non-monetary way of contributing to a political party to hide their hand of undue influence to any political party of their choice. We therefore recommend that the NCOP take seriously the clause that we've inserted, if you could go to the next slide, around donations in kind, to include in the definition section of this current bill a clause which will allow donations in kind to be disclosed, and again, donations in kind, not all of them, to release the administrative burden, but those donations in kind, so these management fees, public relations services and so forth, above a particular value. Now, the committee will need to sit and decide what that particular value needs to be and how to determine this. But again, this will be crucial if we're wanting to have a piece of legislation which really fulfills the intention of this bill and act. Our third submission relates to the enforcement capacity of this particular piece of legislation. And this is crucial because should the IEC needs to be given sufficient teeth in able to hold political parties to account. We've identified very specific gaps which were raised in the National Assembly process, and we raise again here as areas of concern. The first relates to, if you could go to where the drafting recommendations are. Okay, Isak will get there. I'll just go ahead and talk. Firstly, in relation to Clause 10.3, the prohibition on circumventing the provisions of the bill says that it only relates to that particular chapter. Now, should the committee agree with our submissions around, in particular, the Multi-Party Democracy Fund and the requirement to disclose for this particular section, the prohibition and circumvention clauses will need to apply not only to Chapter 3 of this bill, but to the bill in its entirety to ensure that all aspects of this bill are able to be enforced adequately by the IEC. We also and this comes directly from our work as an investigative journalism unit, but also as a media in general, are concerned that there isn't a sufficient definition of donations or contributions coming from the same source or substantially related sources. So in this scenario, it may be a company or an individual who, to hide their wanting to influence a particular party, bring on board various partners, bring on board various family members, and they individually provide money to a particular party, knowing that the totality of their contribution will be used to yield influence over that particular party. So we would strongly recommend that some kind of definition, and we do provide a full definition in our longer submission, on what constitutes a substantially relates, what constitutes substantially related sources for an individual, for a donor, to ensure that this kind of undue influence isn't exerted. Our last submission related to circumvention is, if you could go to, okay. Okay, so in the bill as it currently stands, reporting to the IEC is only above a particular threshold. We would strongly recommend that the IEC is given, again, more teeth in this matter. So not only are donations which are above a particular threshold being reported to the IEC, but the IEC should be given by political parties all information related to all donors, even below a prescribed threshold, to ensure the IEC is adequately informed to be able to identify possible compromised donations to political parties. So essentially what we're saying is that the public can be given information about donations above a certain threshold, but the IEC should be given full information about all monies political parties are receiving from direct donors. Our last submission before I hand over to CASAC is related to disclosure of political parties' investment arms and investment funds. Now, we know from a lot of the reporting that has come from media companies that this has been a key area where we've seen the undue influence of money in politics, and parties using a party using its investment arm to bolster its own coffers during an election period. The bill is completely silent on this matter. We would make two recommendations, and this is for the committee and honourable members to decide, that either parties' investment arms should either be prohibited in totality, and if that's not possible, because political parties do need to secure these funds for their work, then there should be a public disclosure regime around any monies that parties are able to draw as a result of their investment arms or dividends which they draw through companies which they may have shares or ownership in. Over to you, Zach.
Thank you. In the second part of the presentation, we want to draw your attention to a new set of guidelines that was launched by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights just about 6 weeks ago at their meeting. So these guidelines were not available when we made our initial submissions to the National Assembly, and it has just become available, and we managed.
You're watching SABC News. Now, that was a live crossing to the NCLP sitting, which is busy with
Human People's Rights in a process led by the Special Rapporteur on Access to Information and Freedom of Expression in Africa. Worked for over a period of 2 years as a follow-up to the African Model Law on Access to Information, on a set of guidelines that should be applied to elections in African states. Two of the key clauses I want to read to you. The first one says, state parties shall adopt legislative, administrative, judicial, and other measures to give effect to these guidelines. And the second one, clause 34, is state parties shall in each periodic report submitted to the African Commission in accordance with Article 62 of the African Charter, provide detailed information on the measures taken to facilitate compliance with the provisions of these guidelines. So one should say that many aspects of the current bill already comply with these guidelines. But some of the issues that my colleague referred to are also covered in these guidelines, but is not currently in the bill. So we want to draw the committee's attention to some of the issues in these guidelines, and to then consider to what extent do you think that the current bill should be brought in line with the African guidelines on disclosure of information around elections, or if it is something that needs to be implemented over time. The principles driving the guidelines, I'm listing those here. I don't want to go into detail on it. But it's essentially about proactive disclosure of information by all electoral stakeholders to make sure that citizens are fully informed when they go and vote. The electoral stakeholders who should comply with the African Commission's guidelines include the electoral bodies, but also other parties in the process, like observers, monitors, law enforcement agencies, the media, civil society. But there are 3 specific clauses on political parties. And I have, it's on the screen. Clause 20, there are 2 particular items. One is proactive disclosure by political parties of assets, investments, membership subscriptions, subventions and donations, and secondly, financial schemes initiated. In clause 21, it deals also with a list of financial related issues that should be disclosed, including campaign funding, and it says campaign expenditure broken down into distinct line items and specifying the sources of funding and the actual amount. So you see that it goes a bit further than what is in the current bill. The last clause I want to refer to is clause 22, where it deals specifically with utilization of state resources by any political party and the disclosure of the nature and value of that. You can have a look at the document in full. This is just to draw your attention to the fact that there are some issues here that you may want to incorporate. So in conclusion then, we want to thank the NCOP committee for the opportunity to make the submissions, because we think it can contribute greatly to media freedom in South Africa and importantly to the public's right to know when they go and exercise their votes. We welcome all the steps made so far, and we hope that the NCOP, that your input to the National Assembly will help to make this bill even better. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Can we give over now to honorable members if there's any clarity seeking question? And I don't see any hand. So it means it was quite clear. It was straightforward. So members are actually very clear on it. So can we now, thank you very much for the presentation, appreciate it. Can we now give over to, I think the next presentation will be from COSATU by Mr. Matthew Parks. Thank you very much, thanks.
All right, good afternoon, Chairperson. Afternoon to members and colleagues and comrades and friends. Thanks to the committee for giving COSATU a chance to raise our 2 cents of thought for a very important and very progressive bill before Parliament. My name is Matthew Parks. I'm from COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. And I think I'm here on behalf of our members. We have 1.7 million members, the families and so on. And I think I'll be stating the obvious to say as COSATU, we're quite worried about the extent of corruption in society, particularly with regards to political parties, with government, with business, etc. It's a real virus. And we think it's so dangerous that it's threatening the very survival of our government and our nation. Chair, for that reason, we strongly welcome this bill. It's long overdue, it's progressive. We think it's a good foundational bill. We'll be looking forward to it being passed by Parliament. Chair, I don't think we can overemphasize the extent of corruption in society today. And as COSATU, our members are really bearing the brunt of it. So you would see in ESCOM, we have a situation where management wanted to offer workers a 0% increase, where ESCOM's management wants to reduce the staff complement by a third. We've seen a similar situation where SAA is on the verge of collapse. We have municipalities in virtually all provinces which are on the verge of not being able to pay staff in June and July. We have a Department of Water Affairs, which according to Treasury has basically collapsed. So the extent of corruption, Chair, is very real, and it's a serious crisis. Chair, and I think also to state the obvious is that the public is also losing faith. If we were worried previous elections about declining levels of voter turnout, I think, Chair, we're going to see even more levels of decline next year, and the anger by the public across all political parties. Chair, I know often in the public discourse we blame only the ANC for corruption, but I think, Chair, to be fair, all political parties nowadays are ruling parties. I think even the honorable economic freedom fighters are to some extent ruling parties where they help elect mayors. The DA is obviously a ruling party in many municipalities. Even the ACDP, the UDM, are effectively ruling parties in some municipalities. So the extent of corruption is a threat to all political parties. Chair, we know that some opposition parties express fear about the disclosure clause, fearing that work could lead to intimidation of their donors by national government, or etc. We hear those fears, but we don't think they outweigh the fears of corruption and so on. And we'd rather err on the side of preventing corruption. But yes, Chair, we welcome this bill as an important intervention. Chair, I think specifically the areas we support in the bill, we welcome and we think it's fair the equitable and proportional representation-based funding of parties, balancing between majority parties and opposition parties. We very strongly welcome the prohibitions on funding parties by foreign governments and state agencies as critical, because you could have a scenario where a foreign government says to parties, we'll give you money, but reduce your tariff imports for our goods, or in exchange for votes at the United Nations, as some countries do. We also welcome, Chair, that South African state organs, state-owned companies cannot fund political parties. I think, Chair, it would be very wrong to find ESCOM funding parties, yet saying they cannot afford to pay workers. Chair, I think we also welcome strongly the prohibition, even if it's obvious, of you cannot have funds from the proceeds of crime, knowingly. Chair, we support the requirement for party funding statements to include all donations and to be subject to auditors. That's welcome. We support the powers of the Commission for access to all party funding information, the powers to subpoena, to sanction, the responsibilities of the parties to disclose, and that the Commission must disclose reports to Parliament. We think through Parliament, the public will then be able to access this correctly. Chair, I think we have got two issues which we strongly oppose. And the one is, as a trade union, that we as COSATU, especially public service workers, are being blamed by political parties across the political spectrum for the financial crisis facing the state. We have political parties calling for cutting salaries, reducing the headcount in the state. We have seen that departments across the board are being told to reduce service delivery expenditure. We've got a freeze of vacancies across health departments, education. You have the police committing to reduce the headcount by 3,000 this year. SA planning to retrench about 1,500 workers. So we have that crisis on the one hand, and that crisis is there because of corruption, to be frank, or mismanagement across the board. Yet now political parties are saying, look, there's a need for state funding, increasing state funding for parties. We're not sure how do we justify that, Chair. We know maybe political parties might be for once united across on this need. And we understand it's not easy to fundraise. But Chair, we think really it sends a very painful message. We understand the logic that to reduce the temptation for corruption, let's fund parties, right? parties play an important role. But Chair, that would be equivalent to saying, well, look, in exchange for you not being corrupt, we'll give you some money. We think that's a bit of a flawed logic, Chair. And you remember, Chair, in '94 when we had that whole debate as members of the ANC about the gravy train, and the argument of Madiba that time was that you must pay public reps at decent wage, otherwise you'll open the doors to temptation. And we've seen that has not worked out well, Chair, to state the obvious. So we know members will not agree with us, that's fine. But as COSATU Chair, we are very much frustrated to see that we get whipped in the budget cycles. We'll be whipped by the Honorable Charles de Beer in October in the midterm budget statement cycle, that we are too greedy as workers. Yet, Chair, we see political parties being very militant that they want funding from the state. But we'll leave it at that, Chair, as a political point. Chair, the one proposal we have around amendment to the legislation is the disclosure threshold. So we see that it says, if we've read it correctly, that you do not need to disclose donations of 100,000 and less, right? Chair, I think the previous speaker, Professor Cullen, made the point that 100,000 is a lot of money. We've seen politicians being bribed for 100,000 rand. A person could be creative and simply make donations of 99,000 rand repeatedly and circumvent that disclosure threshold. Chair, look, for us, the bill, why we support it, is because it's based upon principles, right, of transparency, accountability, fighting corruption. So we're not sure what is the threshold where we accept not being transparent, accountable, or fighting corruption. You know, maybe, Chair, to give a parallel, we support safe sex, right? So I'm not sure of any threshold below which we don't support safe sex. It's a principal issue. Chair, our proposal is, COSATU, that you must simply disclose all donations, even if it's 1 cent or 5 cents nowadays. When you get your bank statements from the bank doesn't give you a statement of 100,000 above. It discloses every single cent you receive. So we don't think there can be an administrative or energy or time constraint argument that we're too busy as politicians to disclose below 100,000. You must disclose everything. The bank will print for you those things free of charge, or not free of charge, but a small admin fee. So I think, Chair, our proposal is simply to delete all those references to the disclosure threshold. Even if you reduce it to 50,000, we can be creative. We'll make donations of 49,000 rand. So, Chair, for us, it's a fundamental principle. Chair, we feel this threshold clause is so dangerous. You threaten the very noble principles of this entire bill, and we're not sure why. Also, Chair, on that point is that it contradicts other parts of the bill which say that parties must disclose or record all donations to the auditors, etc. Yet somehow here there's that contradiction, Chair. So for us, Chair, we're strongly against it. We've listed the 3 sections which make reference to it, Section 9(1)(a), and the consequential references to it, Chair, in the schedule and so forth. Chair, I can also say, look, as trade unions, part of our requirement to be registered with the Department of Labor is to disclose audited financial statements every year to the Department of Labor. They don't give us a leeway to say, well, look, if it's below 100,000, you're right, you don't need to disclose. It's a principles requirement, all donations. We're sure political parties are very committed to transparency and they would support that. So in conclusion, Chair, we support the progressive objectives of the bill. We support the progressive transparency and accountability clauses. We support the power and the reporting requirements of the Commission. But you would have heard our strong opposition to increasing public funding of parties, given the crisis of the funding in the state. And then lastly, Chair, I propose amendment to the bill about deleting the disclosure thresholds based upon a principled transparency commitment, Chair. So that's in it in a nutshell, Chair. I hope I've not taken too long and that we've added some value to the committee's good work, and we support and look forward to the bill being passed urgently, Chairperson. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation from COSATU. Any clarity-seeking questions, honorable members? I don't see any hand. Oh, I only see Honorable Chabango. Don't exhaust your airtime for deliberations, honorable member. On a light note. Over to you, Honorable Chabango.
Yeah,
Thanks.
My simple contribution is COSATU Mr. Matthews Parks. Yeah, that is not my language in a way. Most of the municipalities are under your alliance leadership rule. let alone the municipalities that have collapsed countrywide. And you come and tell us that you fight corruption. What is it that we have done to contribute to the allocation?
Honorable Chabangu.
No, he has started by attacking us here.
Honorable Chabangu, I see there are two hands. I don't know whether it's point of orders or what is it. Yeah, Honorable Dlamini and Honorable Mutlashupi.
No, thank you very much, Honorable Chair. On a point of order, it's clarity-seeking questions. You were very much clear at the beginning of this meeting. As a committee, we're going to have time to deal with this presentation. It's not the last time. It's just as good as if they had submitted documents which we will not have time to engage on. For now, it's just clarity-seeking question where we don't understand. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you very much. I think, let me make a ruling on this, Honorable Chabangu. The order, the point of order is sustained. You are still going, your political party, the EFF, they are also scheduled to make a presentation to the committee. That's the first thing. And I think if there's any allegation by COSATU to the EFF, they will also have an opportunity to clarify and respond. And then secondly, we are also scheduled as the committee for our own deliberations next week, where we'll go in detail about each and every presentation that was made here. So in the interest of time, honorable members, I will actually request that we proceed. We give you an opportunity to express, your clarity-seeking question based on the presentation. And then other issues, let's isolate them as we move forward. Honorable Chabangu.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Please, with due respect, don't allow people to come and cast aspersions. They must just do what is supposed to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's give over to COSATU. I'm not sure whether you want to respond to that. Yeah, but you know what I'm actually cautioning? I don't want it to be an exchange of words between COSATU and the EFF. Because actually, Honorable Chabangu was actually responding to the statement which you actually raised in your presentation. So if I give you now also to respond, you will also feel obliged to respond. So I'm actually, with the powers vested in me, let me make a middle ground ruling and then proceed and then close the presentation of COSATU. I think most of the members are agreeing with me on that. So let's not open it up too much. Let's agree. You have made your presentation. We've heard what are the proposals you are making. And then we move forward in that regard. Thank you very much, COSATU, for the presentation. And then if there's any clarity that needs to be given, apart from what is actually before us, I'm sure honorable members can entertain that issue outside. And then we now move over to the next presentation, honorable members, which will be done by my vote counts. It will be done by Ms. Janine Ogle and Ms. Zaira Kremoto. Over to you. My vote counts. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the honourable members for providing us with the opportunity to make our submissions in person to you. My name is Janine Ogle. I'm the National Coordinator of My Vote Counts, and my colleague is Zahira Grimwood. She's the researcher at My Vote Counts, focusing on our political system. My Vote Counts is a civil society organization. We launched as a campaign in 2012, but formally registered as a non-profit company in 2014. Our work aims to advance transparency and accountability as enshrined in our constitution, and our focus is on the political system and the electoral system of South Africa. Our focus on the political system since 2012 has been to advocate for transparency pertaining to the private funding of political parties. We were therefore very pleased when the ANC in Parliament initiated the process to draft this bill in May last year. And subsequently, the depth, seriousness, focus, and efficiency with which this bill has progressed through Parliament thus far. The bill, even if in its current form, is leaps and bounds from where we were this time last year. And this is because through this bill, we are in agreement that there must be transparency on political party funding, but also we are in agreement that the private funding of political parties must be regulated. Our submission then that my colleague will present focuses on the few areas that we propose should be amended in order to ensure that the bill goes as far as possible towards meeting its objectives. But before I hand over to my colleague, I think it would be remiss of me if I did not state, for those who are not aware, that we are currently the applicants in a Constitutional Court application for the Western Cape High Court judgment that found that the information about the private funding of political parties is reasonably required for the effective exercise of the right to make an informed vote. We've made this application to the Constitutional Court. The hearing was held in March, and we are basically just waiting for the judgment. I will now hand over to Zahira, who will go through the specific proposals that we are making for amendments to this bill.
Over to you, Honorable Mutlashup. Is it a point of exigency or
No.
privilege?
No, no exigency.
Oh, okay.
I just want to understand, because more often than not, we would be discussing matters that are before courts to make a determination. And we are at times, in terms of the rules, deterred from engaging in such an exercise, taking into account the independence of each organ of the state. Now, what I'm trying to say, Chair, is that the submissions as suggested by my vote counts, are they the very same submissions that are before the Constitutional Court? Okay, thank you.
Is it a clarity-seeking point? Can we please just suspend it for a later, after the presentation is done? Is it fine? Thank you. Over to you.
Good afternoon, honourable members. Janine has already introduced me, but just to kindly introduce myself, my name is Zahira Grimwood, and I'm a party funding researcher at My Vote Counts. Just to outline what our presentation will focus on, we'll go into suggested amendments that we think is important for the committee to take into consideration. Firstly, we will explore issues pertaining to the funds, mainly focusing on the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. Secondly, we explore issues pertaining to direct funding of political parties. And then thirdly, we'll explore disclosure aspects which we think should be addressed in order for the bill to sufficiently address transparency. Honourable members, in clause 3, subsection 5, it states that any contributor contemplated in subsection 3A may request the Commission not to disclose the identity or the amount of the contribution. Honourable members, we believe that this clause goes against the spirit of the bill to ensure transparency of private donor information and should not have been included in the bill at all. There's also the risk that a donor may want to curry favour from several political parties, and this clause would allow them to do so anonymously. Therefore, MVC proposes that clause 3, subsection 5 be removed from this bill. On the next issue with the Multi-Party Democracy Fund, honourable members, in the bill's current form, the Multi-Party Democracy Fund only makes provision for the national and provincial legislatures to benefit from the fund. We are aware that the Constitution limits the provision of public funding to political parties in the national and provincial legislatures. However, there is no constitutional basis to exclude local government from benefiting from the MPDF. Seeing as local government is a sphere of government that directly interfaces and serves our local communities, it should not be excluded from benefiting from the fund. Thirdly, with regards to the MPDF, Clause 6, subsection 2 states that any allocation from the funds must be made to a represented political party in accordance with the prescribed formula. And in Clause 2, subsection 2 of the regulations, it refers to the percentages for the proportional and equitable distribution of the MPDF, whereby the proportional allocation stands at 66.67% and the equitable allocation stands at 33.33%. Seeing as the MPDF was formulated to allow for a donor to not be affiliated to one political party and donate to advance multi-party democracy, represented political parties should therefore benefit more fairly from this fund, and we would propose that the allocation formula be changed so that 50% is allocated proportionally and 50% is allocated equitably. The next issue we raise is in connection with the Represented Political Party Fund and the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. In Clause 7 of the bill, it includes permissible expenditure items and categories for the funds, but the list of items is concerningly vague. These items include the political will of the people and exercising an influence on political trends. The danger is that each expenditure item is open for interpretation, rendering the clause meaningless. Clause 7 must comprehensively specify exactly what a party may spend funds on. I will now go into issues on direct funding. Honourable members are already aware that the bill prohibits certain sources of donations. In Clause 8, subsection 1b, it prohibits foreign entities from donating to political parties. However, in Clause 8, subsection 4b, there's an exception made for foreign entities to donate to a political party for the purpose of policy development of that political party. We believe that foreign entities should not be allowed to donate to a political party for any purposes, and allowing foreign entities to donate for the sake of policy development poses a potential danger to our democracy. If an external actor may have a bearing on policy development in our country, we think that is very dangerous to our democracy. On the issue of investment vehicles, we think that investments made to parties' investment vehicles should be monitored, as should all financial contributions made to political parties. The risk that we want to identify is that a donor may be able to find a loophole to donate through an investment vehicle and not directly to a party. And through investing, it would not have to be disclosed. We therefore think that it's imperative that a transparency provision is included in the bill to monitor investments made to parties' investment vehicles. On the issue of prohibitions, Clause 8, subsection 1 prohibits certain sources of donations but does not prohibit donations from companies that do business with the state. If it is disclosed that a company who's doing business with the state is donating to a political party, the public may be seriously concerned that such a company is unduly gaining favor from a political party. If a company's contract with the state has ended and a sufficient time has passed since a company has made contact with the state, then the company should be allowed to donate. However, we propose that a provision be included in the bill to prevent companies that do business with the state from donating to political parties. And we'd further propose that the bill include a cooling off period so that 2 years after a company has donated and no longer has contact with a political party, it can then donate. Then in Clause 8, subsection 2, it states that a political party may not accept a donation from a person or entity in excess of the prescribed amount within a financial year. This prescribed amount is referred to as 15 million rand in Clause 7 of the regulations. We believe that this amount is too high. We identify the risk here of such a high amount making a party completely dependent on a single donor, affording a donor significant power over a party. Once again, I want to emphasize that the spirit of the bill is to curb the influence of donors and parties and to avoid a situation where donors can buy influence over a political party at the expense of the electorate. The amount decided upon must take South Africa's socio-economic context into account, and we therefore propose that the amount be pegged to the income of the most marginalized economic group in South Africa, which is black women. We've based our estimation on a business tech report where it referred to the median income of black women in 2016 as 34,644 Rand, which gives an estimate of the amount that we think that the upper limit should be pegged to. The last issue we would like to highlight on direct funding relates to clause 10, subsection 1, where it states that no person or entity may deliver a donation to a member of a political party other than for party political purposes. We believe that no member should directly receive a donation, whether for party political purposes or not. The risk in allowing a member to directly receive a donation is that a high-ranking member may receive hundreds of thousands of rands in donations, the party may be unaware, and it would not be accounted for. All donations should be allocated to the bank account parties are obligated to open specifically for receiving direct donations, which will be monitored by the IEC, and thereafter the party may allocate funding to members. In clause 9, subsection 3, honourable members, it states that the Commission must publish the donations disclosed to it in the prescribed form and manner and on a quarterly basis. For the sake of clarity and to avoid the risk of information on direct donations only being disclosed to Parliament, this clause must state that the information will be published to the public. In Clause 9, subsection 1A, it states that a political party must disclose to the Commission all donations received above the prescribed threshold. And Clause 9 of the regulation states that the amount of the prescribed threshold is 100,000 Rand. I would like to reiterate that this bill was also formulated to prevent certain situations which would allow a donor or the wealthy elite to have influence over a political party. So in the socio-economic context of South Africa, where the average voter cannot afford 100,000 Rand or even any amount less than that, we should not treat donations of 100,000 Rand or lower as insignificant amounts which should not be accounted for. Especially at the local level, donations lower than 100,000 Rand can influence a political party or independent ward candidate, and we therefore propose that this amount be lowered to 10,000 Rand.
Thank you very much for the presentation. That was very quick and straightforward to the point. No, thank you very much. Honorable members, I think you have noted the issue raised by Honorable Mutlashuping on the issues that are before the court. So that will be the first one. The second one, I've noted Honorable Monakedi, Honorable Labaskachni, Honorable Mutlashuping wants to come back again. I think it'll be the last one. Is your hand up, Honorable Chabangu? Are you fine? Okay. So it's only the 3 hands in that order. Thanks.
Thanks, Chairperson, and also to the presentation as made. Your assertion that there is no constitutional nor legislative basis to exclude local government from benefiting from the arrangements that the bill is bringing about seems to be contradicted by what is provided for in section 236 of the Constitution, because explicitly in that section or clause of the Constitution, it is indicated therein or provided in that is only political parties participating in the provincial and national legislatures that can actually be supported, as indeed is proposed in terms of the bill. So I just want you to come back and clarify your assertion. Thank you.
Thanks. Honorable Labaskachni.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to go to the proposal of the monitoring of the investment vehicles. I would like to know, I would like some more clarity on your proposal. I would like to know these investment vehicles that you feel that should be monitored. should that be those that already existing, or should it be only from the inception of the bill? And whichever way you decide, before and or after, who should take the responsibility of this monitoring? And if it is the responsibility of the IEC, we already heard that the IEC have some problems in the capacity, but we will talk to them later on that. And then I would like to know, what do you see as the monitoring tools? What would you see, how would that be done? By reports, by, how do you see? Because just to tell us, amend the bill without a clear vision of how you want it to be amended, I need some clarity on that. Thank you.
Honorable Mutlashupi.
No, Chair, I wanted to assist you that it would not benefit this meeting for me to seek clarity from my vote counts, because the question that I was asking is self-explanatory, and I do not want to engage in an academic exercise or definition exercise, because the bill is political party funding bill. And if I ask a question about local government, and there are complexities about individuals contesting, and they are not political parties, so it's self-explanatory. I don't have to go into detail I'll discuss it at the level of the committee. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you very much, Honorable Mutlashupi. Over to you, ma'am.
Sorry. Thank you. I'll start with the question around the constitutional provisions. What we mean is the constitutional provisions that you mentioned regarding public funding to the province, to the provincial level and the national level. Those refer to public funding. Money that will go into the multi-party democracy fund is not public funding, it's private funding. Therefore, there's nothing in the Constitution preventing money that goes into the multi-party democracy fund from being distributed also to the local government level, because the constitutional provisions regard public funding to the provincial and national level. We are not disputing money from the represented political parties fund. We are suggesting that for the multi-party democracy fund, which will be private funds, only that it will be managed by the IEC, but it's still private funds, that should be allowed to also be, to fund parties at the local government level. Regarding the monitoring of investment vehicles, our concern there is that this bill does not speak to transparency around investment vehicles that political parties have. We are calling it investment vehicles. People can call it political companies that are linked to political parties, investment arms, etc. What we are arguing here is that entities that are closely linked to political parties, and especially if they are investment vehicles, should be regulated within this bill. The way in which they would be regulated is up to the committee to decide, but at the very least, there should be transparency, because they are, for us at least, part and parcel of those political parties, because whatever work they do is towards supporting and providing funding to the political party and its activities. I will touch a bit on the court case, because there is one aspect that I think impacts on this process. The current court case is a challenge to the Promotion of Access to Information Act. And we were directed by a constitutional court judgment that said that the information that we wanted when we initially went to the Constitutional Court in 2015, that the information that My Vote Counts wants is in essence access to information, and My Vote Counts should go and use this access to information legislation to get the information that it wants. And if it's unable to access that information through PIA, go challenge PIA in the High Court. We then did that launching our application in 2016. In 2017, the application was heard in the Western Cape High Court. And the order of the judgment says that information about the private funding of political parties and independent candidates, which you will understand then means local government, information about political parties and independent candidates is reasonably required for the effective exercise of the right to vote. That's the first part. The second part is that PAIA is inconsistent with the Constitution because it does not allow for access to this information. And then it says the defects in PAIA need to be remedied by Parliament. So I think the judge in that case has worded the order very carefully in that it's not saying go and amend PAIA. It's saying there are defects in PAIA that Parliament must remedy. We would argue that the current process of drafting this bill is actually remedying those defects in PAIA, because this bill will then allow us for access to the information that we want. What maybe, once we receive the judgment, and we are fairly confident that it will be in our favor, I think an issue that Parliament will have to deal with is that this bill as it stands does not deal with independent candidates at all, whereas the judgment deals with political parties and independent candidates. But I think that's, as the judge said, these are things that Parliament needs to decide how it will address. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Honorable Abskachny wanted to raise another follow-up. Over to you, Honorable Abskachny.
I'm not so sure if my vote counts will be able to bring me clarity. I'm thinking that this is rather a question that we as a committee should look at. My question would be is, I understand the reasoning between public funding that's described in section 236 of the Constitution, and the aim of this bill is for private funding. Now, if you look at the multi-party democracy of the funding in this bill, then it prescribes the activities for political activities for a multi democracy establishment. So it does not refer in this bill to say that political activity is just focused on a national or a national election. So if there is a local government election, it is a party who is driving the election, not the government, not the local government, not the structure of the municipality. So I need clarity, and therefore I'm saying that maybe it's not a question to this specific organization, but a question of clarity that we have to find a solution for within this committee. Thank you.
Okay. Honorable Munakiri, you want to respond to it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I somewhat also agree with the statements as expressed by the latter speaker, but also indicate that in that section 236, there is nowhere where they are talking about public funding. 236 talks about funding, whether private or public. So it can be correct, therefore, to then want to say that because, yeah, we have had public funding all along, it means you can't have an arrangement in terms of that loss once more to then source in private funding to once again support parties participating at national and provincial legislature. The difference between this bill and what has been there, what has been in place, is that now we are making provision for also private donors to come on board and support parties participating in provincial legislature and national legislature as per section 236 of the Constitution. Thanks.
Thank you, Honorable Munakiri, for the clarity. Do you want to also add on to it, or are you fine? feel free to clarify.
Yes, I think we'll probably have to agree to disagree because my understanding of Section 236 is that the Public Funding Act that we currently have was drafted specifically to give effect to that provision, which focuses on public funding. But I mean, I'd have to look at the wording in order to have this conversation further.
No, thank you very much. I think there are two issues for me. The first one about the issue of public funding and the clause 236 in the Constitution. As a committee also will have an opportunity to delve into much detail when we have our meeting next week. And then the second issue about the court case, matters that are before the court, I think there the principle of sub judice must actually apply. Because in actual fact, it does not stop us as Parliament to move forward on the bill itself, on the implementation of the bill. Because those matters are before the court. So up until the court is actually pronounced or there's a judgment, I think we need to respect the fact that those issues are before the court, so we are not at liberty to discuss and go into detail about such issues. I think it's a fair comment for me to make. So I think on that note, honorable members, let's actually close it and wrap up your presentation, and then actually thank you for coming through. And then we actually noted your proposals that you are making. So thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. Thanks. It's really appreciated. Honorable members, I will just need your advice here. We were supposed to have had to be having a comfort break. Now, I'm not sure because I saw honorable members were actually embarking on some sort of a comfort break. And I saw Honorable Mutlashuping and Honorable Munakedi. So I don't know whether we are still supposed to have it. We're supposed to break for 10 minutes. Honorable Shabangu?
Chairperson, my proposal would be we must have a meeting, maybe while we have that break. In other words, we can have whatever we want to have, but proceed with the meeting peacefully.
Okay. Any other proposal? Honorable Nita wants to propose something different.
No, thanks, Chair. I think we do need the comfort break.
Okay.
Thanks.
No, thank you very much. Can we agree it's now 10 to 4? Can we be back at 4 o'clock? Let's have a 10-minute comfort break. Thank you.
Concern with the proposed bill is one of unintended consequences and not the intentions or how the bill is written, which is usually our concern, but not this time. The bill itself is attempting to realize the constitutional principles of open and constitutional governance and transparency. These are obviously values found in Section 1D of our Constitution, which our Rule of Law project is very much all about. The bill itself is well written and in general, but not absolutely. Its contents are unobjectionable. The Free Market Foundation has a 43-year history of fighting for an open society founded on the rule of law and good governance. We were founded in 1975 in the height of apartheid, and we've been fighting against injustice ever since. In particular, that's relevant today for the bill is our public participation project. which emphasizes that the public should get involved in the law-making process, and our socio-economic impact assessment project, which is also about giving the public information about interventions proposed by government, especially in the economy.
I'm sorry, sir. Is the presentation in the pack? Is it here? Is in here?
Yeah, it is in the pack. Okay, now you can proceed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it goes without saying that we support in principle the underlying objective of the bill. The public should have, and indeed does have, a right to know who funds political parties. Political parties are not simply private associations, as many argue. They are organizations with the stated intention of governing over a significant part of, or the whole of our society. Political parties do, therefore, occupy an interesting space straddling the so-called public-private divide in society. But because they propose to rule over us, make law for us, and take our tax money, there is a clear need for us to know who our political parties are serving, us or some foreign interests, us or some ideological interests, us or themselves. So transparency in party funding is therefore one of the ways to shed light on this. So I hope it is clear to the members of this committee that the Free Market Foundation is not against the bill per se as it stands. Our concern instead is with the legislative and regulatory environment in which this bill is being implemented, will be implemented. And in this respect, we much urge Parliament, and especially this committee, to observe caution in whether or not to adopt and pass the bill right now, as opposed to somewhere down the line. We believe that certain things need to happen before the bill is passed. Otherwise, South Africa may venture down a path of unintended consequences that may decimate our democracy. So allow me to preface the concerns I will be highlighting with the following statement. The Free Market Foundation is and always has been a non-partisan member of our civil society. We support ideas, values, principles, and policies, not parties. And we oppose certain ideas and policies, not parties. Nothing I have to say here today should be construed as an attack on any particular political party. What I intend to do is problematize a system and a recurring phenomenon in lawmaking in South Africa and abroad. This phenomenon is not limited to the ruling party, and indeed has been exhibited by parties that have governed the whole and different parts of South Africa in the past and today. The phenomenon I am referring to is the excessive and often untethered discretionary powers that are bestowed by the national and provincial legislatures of our country on officials within the executive government. Section 1C of the Constitution provides that South Africa is founded upon the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. This means that the Constitution itself does not stand alone as a component of our constitutional democracy. No, the Constitution says that it and the rule of law are supreme. These are the two peaks of constitutionalism in South Africa. But we do often forget about the rule of law as a constitutional imperative. We all say and believe we support this notion, but that is often only rhetorical. In practice, we have shown much contempt for the rule of law indeed. The rule of law, according to the late Justice Tolakele Madala, in the constitutional case of Van der Walt versus Metcash, amounts to, among other things, the absence of arbitrary power and excludes unreasonableness and unpredictability. A good way to think about the rule of law is that it means we are ruled by the law and not by the arbitrary whims of personalities. This means that at no point must the law be capable of being applied simply according to the discretion of an official. Some of you may recall that during apartheid, arbitrary discretion was infamously used for racial classification and other forms of state tyranny, when officials were simply empowered to conduct the so-called pencil test to determine who was of what race. Security laws empowered ministers to throw people in jail simply because they suspected them of being communist propagandists. The Constitution was intended to put a stop to this legal delinquency and committed South Africa explicitly to the rule of law. When South Africans go to the ballot box every 5 years, we elect Parliament, you in other words, not the bureaucrats in our executive government. We ask that you, Parliament, the National Council of Provinces and the National Assembly, make the laws that will bind us in our day-to-day lives. We do not ask this of officials. Unfortunately, we continue to have legislation on the statute book from before and after apartheid fell that assigns unjustifiably wide discretionary powers on officials within the executive government. And this gives officials too great a power over things properly reserved for Parliament. In certain industries, companies, or people who are associated with those companies on a high level, like directors or senior managers, must maintain an impeccable personal and professional relationship with the regulators of their industries. Now, good personal relationships are obviously a good thing in our society, but not if they are manufactured simply to ensure that regulatory bullying does not occur, or intimidation. Whether or not someone is treated fairly by government should not depend on whether the officials in government actually takes a liking to those particular persons or companies. In light of the political party funding bill, this assignment of wide discretionary powers will create a problem, especially for the funding of political parties that are not in government. Many, if not most, of the people who are currently funding one of the opposition parties will not want their names to be made public. This is so because they will fear retaliation from their industry regulators. Even if the companies are not funding the opposition parties, directors and senior managers in their personal capacity will fear that their association with the company might cause a reaction from their regulators, which will be to the company's detriment. Imagine, if you will, that an explicitly anti-apartheid party was founded during the previous regime, and a bill like the political funding bill was enacted. Let's say that a director of a big company in the retail industry was funding this anti-apartheid political party. Now, because the director himself opposed apartheid, he funded this party. But the director of the company knows the company depends on a license to operate, for example, in a particular area. The national party regulator in his industry, he fears, will not allow him to renew his license or will impose some or other regulatory obligation on his company that it cannot comply with. He will thus stop funding the anti-apartheid party because obviously the national party regulator may try and score some points in this way. I make up this hypothetical scenario from the apartheid era simply for us to distance ourselves emotionally from the current parties in our parliament. As I said, this is a systemic problem that is evident elsewhere in the world, especially in the United States. It is only a bigger problem in South Africa because we have a far higher corruption perception ranking than, say, the United States, Botswana, or Japan. Last year, for example, South Africa scored 43 out of 100 in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. The US scored 75, Botswana 61, and Japan 73. The higher the number, the better. The lower the number, the worse the perception of corruption in society is. So we score quite below average there. You must understand that this is not to say that regulators will in fact take action against companies or people who fund opposition parties. I cannot know that they will, and I have no doubt that the vast majority of our civil service is of an impeccable moral character. This is simply about perceptions and fears, whether they are well-founded or not. We know that as a result of the assignment of wide discretionary powers, there will be sufficient fear amongst the funders of political parties that regulatory bullying will ensue if the funding is made public, and they will thus stop funding even before the bill is passed, likely. It is clear that government does not intend for regulatory bullying to happen. This is why in the beginning I said that our concerns relate to unintended consequences. The unintended consequence of this bill is that funding of opposition political parties by private persons will or may certainly decrease dramatically to avoid retaliation from industry regulators. Only if this problem is fixed will the fear by current and potential funders subside. The problem, of course, is the wide discretionary powers and legislative provisions that are assigning powers to officials. And we submit that it is a bad idea to pass the political party funding bill right now before these problems are rectified. Parliament can solve this problem by changing provisions in other legislation, not the political party funding bill, that assign wide discretionary powers and rather include a list of criteria that regulators must adhere to in making their decisions rather than their own discretion. Some provisions say that a regulator must make a bill in the public interest. This is a very popular one. Or says, like the new tobacco bill does, that the minister may make a decision simply if he or she is satisfied that it is the correct decision in the context. These kinds of provisions are problematic in a society apparently under the rule of law. The tobacco bill, which the Free Market Foundation opposes because of its content, can be saved from a rule of law perspective by simply removing the power of the minister to decide on a whim where to prohibit smoking. The bill is specific about where smoking is prohibited, so this extra power for the minister is simply unnecessary, but also very dangerous. And this is just one example of how Parliament can improve the regulatory and legislative environment to make passing a bill like the political party funding bill far more appropriate. I thank you for your time and would happily answer questions or receive your comments.
Oh, thank you. That's the presentation, honorable members. Honorable Dlamini will be the first. Over to you, Honorable Dlamini.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. He's saying it was progressive, but he couldn't find where the presentation was on the document. Honorable Chairperson, thank you very much. Let me welcome the presentation and start off by saying I couldn't find it in the document. I must have missed. You'll pardon me if I ask things that you would have said. I couldn't follow you on the document. I tried my best to follow as you were presenting, but also maybe because he was too fast for me. I said he.
Said she.
I did. No, I have a gap here. So
You're protected, Honorable Dlamini.
he sounds like a she. Honorable Chair, he said in the presentation, I heard him saying that it will not be ideal for us to pass the bill now in this environment. Maybe at some stage later. So my question is, what will be, if you were to be given an opportunity to do that, what is the ideal time for you? When do you think will be the ideal time or conducive environment for Parliament to pass this bill? And the second matter, the presentation is more on opposition parties, people not being free because they will be known that they're associated with this company. The company might be affected because of that. There will always be opposition parties. At what stage do you think that, if I heard you correct, there will be time where there are no opposition parties, then a bill can be passed? As said earlier, Chairperson, I might have missed some of the things. Oh, the last one, Chair. I found a contradiction on the presentation because on the example he made about corruption, where we are in terms of ranking as a country as compared to other countries, my contradiction, the contradiction I found is that this bill for me, one of the objectives is to ensure that there is transparency, which is a problem for him that we're ranking low currently as a country. But also, he's talking about corruption, but at the same time, for me, this bill is trying to deal with corruption. So I don't know, I found a contradiction there. Thank you, Chair. If I could be clarified.
No, thanks, Honorable Damin. Any other clarity-seeking question, Honorable Member? So it looks like there's only two issues raised by Honorable Damin. Over to you,
First
Mr.
of
van
all,
Staden.
I apologize for speaking so quickly. This is my first time in Parliament, so I'm a bit new here to this, but I would happily address your concerns. As to when, it's not a matter of when, but rather under what conditions. So I think the bill should be passed when certain conditions have changed in South Africa. And that specifically, as I mentioned, is we need to really change how laws are currently being made. Currently, there's it seems like a culture, and it's not only limited to South Africa. The rest of the world has done this. That is completely contrary to the rule of law, where excessive discretion is granted to government in legislation rather than Parliament itself saying what should happen. It gives a regulator the power to decide what should happen in specific instances. So the Free Market Foundation has done research on various pieces of legislation, and if I may, let me provide an example from the Electricity Regulation Act of 2006, which provides that no one may operate an electricity generation, transmission, or distribution facility, or import or export electricity, or be involved in the trading of electricity without a license issued by the regulator. And the regulator is not obliged to issue a license. The regulator may also make a license subject to any conditions and vary any conditions if it is necessary for the purposes of the Act. This is an example of unfettered discretion in an Act. So this regulator, whoever he or she may be, essentially has the power to legislate by decree, rule by diktat in his industry. So it's legislation like this, and specifically provisions like this in legislation all across the country, provincial legislatures, provincial legislation, bylaws in municipalities. It's found everywhere. This needs to change. There should be a wholesale legislative review, for example, like the high-level panel recently did. Look at what legislation we have, recommend changes to fix those provisions, and then I would say would be an opportune time to bring in this law. So for example, we see in the United States, they have a law like this, and there we have people in companies, rich people, being very open about the political parties they support, and that's good. There's complete transparency in that regard, and I think we, South Africa, should get there eventually. But in the US, they don't have the perception that they will be bullied by their regulators. In South Africa, that is different. On your second question, on whether or not there will be opposition parties, I don't doubt that there will always be opposition parties, but our concern is that it will be significantly more difficult for opposition parties to mount an effective campaign under the conditions currently prevalent in South Africa if this bill is passed. So it will be very difficult for them to have funding, and in so doing they may lose significant resources and so forth, as opposed to the governing party. And again, this depends on where you are in South Africa. In the Western Cape, there's a different governing party. So, and then to your last point about the contradiction, yes, the bill's objective is to bring about transparency and is definitely aimed against corruption. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, we are completely in principle behind the bill. It's definitely a worthy intervention. Our concern is simply that even though it's a bill of good intentions, there will be unintended consequences. So the bill itself is great from a rule of law perspective, with minor concerns that it's not that we're not going to get into now from the Free Market Foundation's perspective. But we're afraid of what's going to happen downstream, so to say, from the bill. So our concern is not with the bill, but rather what's going to happen around it. And we believe sincerely that it may lead to corruption being getting worse from a perception perspective, not necessarily actually regulators bullying companies, but there is this perception amongst South Africans that the government is corrupt. The courts have said that this is trite in South Africa, and that is our concern. There's a perception, and because of that perception, the funding of opposition parties may dry up. I really hope that answers your question.
No, thank you. I saw the other two hands. The hand of, I've noted Honorable Mtlashuping and then Honorable Mita.
Thank you, Chairperson. The perception in South Africa is that there are, of course, individuals that are corrupt and not the government. It's a generally accepted perception in South Africa, not government as such. The other issue is that in South Africa equally, when elections are conducted, I don't want you to respond. It's public knowledge. When elections are conducted in South Africa, are conducted on an equal basis, with the same market, which means same constituency where we go and lobby for votes, and there is no ruling party, there is no opposition, there is nothing. All political parties that exist, the playing field is level for them to go and lobby, and the results will then determine who becomes the ruling party and who becomes the opposition at that point. That is why you hear Honorable Labuskachne every time preaching, we are going to be the new government. She knows that we are starting on an equal basis. We are not advantaged already when we start
Sorry,
the
Chair,
elections.
on a point of order, we're not busy with a political debate.
No, it's not a
We are
political
busy-
debate. What I'm trying to say is that we are not starting elections on an unequal basis. We are starting equally, at zero, all of us. That must be understood. Thank you.
Thanks. I think this is just a general comment. It's not a clarity-seeking point. So we'll not respond to it. Yeah. Honorable Mita.
Thanks, Chair. Chair, in his presentation, he mentions that there are some countries who are having counterbalance, maybe systems. And as South Africa, as you have alluded to the fact that is perceived some individuals to be corrupt. But what I want to know from him, in terms of what the issue of counterbalance, when do you think we can be ready as South Africa in terms of those systems in place? Because it looks like, in your view, we cannot proceed with the bill unless we deal with the particular issue. So I just want to be clarified on that matter. Thank you.
Thanks, Honorable Ngita. Over to you, Mr. Van Staden.
Well, a good way, I guess, to say when the right time would be is when we actually climb the ladder in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. So currently, like I said, we scored 43 out of 100. The higher the number, the better. So we're currently under half. And so if the perception of corruption in South Africa significantly declines, I would say perhaps getting to the 70s, around there. That would probably be a good, more appropriate time, although 100 would probably be the best.
Thank you. I think that brings us to the end of the presentation. I think the issues were fairly covered. Would like to thank you for coming through, availing yourself.
Thank you, Chair.
To make such a presentation. You are now released. Our next presentation will be done from Right2Know. It will be done by Mr. Murray Hunter. Over to you, Mr. Hunter. You can sit somewhere here in front. We want to get, we want to be able to see you very closely when you are making your presentation. Over to you, sir. You can proceed.
Thank you very much, Chair, and just thank you to all of the honourable members. My name is, as the Chair said, my name is Murray Hunter. I'm a researcher and an organizer with the Right2Know Campaign. My colleague who actually drafted the submission, Muleki Marongo, couldn't join us here today, so I'm here before you. I think we firstly want to note, I'm assuming that the background to the Right2Know campaign is noted in the beginning of our submission, so if there are any questions, I can address them afterwards. But I think we want to note firstly just our thanks to the NCOP and to your colleagues in the National Assembly for the work that has been done in the last year to actually produce the bill as it is now. I think that we really are in a different place and with new prospects for democracy that we didn't have before those steps were taken. So this is a really positive development. The Right2Know, as the name would suggest, is obviously an organization that is fervent in the belief that the people of South Africa do have a right to know who is funding their political parties, that there needs to be a great deal of transparency over the funding of our politics and the makeup of our political ecosystem. So clearly the moves that have been made in the bill are a good thing. We would align ourselves very closely with the submission that was made by My Vote Counts, and they had a number of detailed proposals that I won't go into, but our submission really stresses 5 key points. I think the first key point that I'd like to point out is the need for the disclosures, the threshold for disclosures to be raised from the 100,000 Rand. This is something that has been touched on by a number of different submissions, but I think it's worth going over. If we're all here agreeing that the public has a right to know who is funding political parties, that there is a need for transparency, it is not clear why the threshold for 100,000 Rand has been chosen. Unfortunately, we've made some attempts to find out some basic information about what the picture looks like for political parties, about what sort of donations they're receiving. So we don't have a good sense at this moment of what proportion of donations to political parties would fall above or below that threshold. But our assumption is that a great many donations would be excluded at 100,000 Rand. We're talking about quite a high number. In our submission, we had suggested that given the extreme inequality and the pervasive poverty in our society, where 100,000 Rand is so far beyond what an ordinary citizen could ever hope to donate to a political party that we should reduce that, and it should in some way be linked to the average household income or something like that. The suggestion that has been made by My Vote Counts of a 10,000 Rand cap, we could go with that. We weren't meaning to be prescriptive to the committee. I think it is very difficult to identify a marker that isn't arbitrary without some kind of provision of information from political parties about what the situation is currently. So it is very difficult to regulate in that lack of transparency, but we think that a 10,000 Rand cap as opposed to a 100,000 Rand cap is something that we could get behind. So that was the first point, was lowering the threshold. I think the second point, and this is also something that's been touched on by several submissions, is the need to give much better clarity about what public disclosure will actually mean. We've seen that we've seen a lack of clarity in the provisions about to whom the Commission will be disclosing this information. Will it be to Parliament? Will it be to the National Assembly? Or will it be to the public? For us, we think as public as that information can be, there should be a proactive disclosure. It should be on a website. You should be able to download it in an open format so that members of the public, so that voters can look at it, so that researchers can look at it, journalists, and of course, members of political parties can also look at that information. So we want to see a very open disclosure, and I think that needs to be clarified in the legislation. That was the second point, is ensuring full disclosure. A third point which we've raised in our submission is that there needs to be some prohibition on political party donors doing business with the state. This is the biggest pattern we've seen for corruption in party politics. From the information that is publicly available, as I said, in the lack of transparency, it's difficult to always draw these conclusions. But the biggest avenue for corruption in South Africa, in the way that we've seen in other democracies as well, is this pay-to-play. You give a donation, you get a tender. You give a donation, you get some kind of favor. And the only way that we feel this can be dealt with is by putting a clear prohibition on donors that you're not going to get business for it. And if those who are doing business with the state who still want to contribute towards the functioning of political parties, which is a very good imperative, can do so through a multi-party democracy fund. So that cap is necessary, and we've also suggested that that be expanded to include investment vehicles as well. Parties' investment vehicles, we would like to see assurances that these investment vehicles won't be given some kind of equity in deals and those sorts of things. The fourth point we wanted to stress was the need for the public funding mix to be given a greater emphasis on political diversity. So rather than the 90-10 mechanism that we've seen in the past, we think something like a 50-50 would be good. So there's some proportionality, but also a sharing of those public funds to ensure that smaller parties, that political diversity is possible and is encouraged through the funding. And again, we haven't been prescriptive in our suggestions. We've just said we think that the legislation should lean in a different direction. And then the final point, and I think this is touching on something I've said already, is the need for some kind of historical transparency. Because we have a current situation where, let's assume that the bill is passed in the lead up to the 2019 elections, that it's implemented in the lead up to the 2029 elections. I think that would be a very positive thing. But it is very concerning that the historical record will never be corrected, that there won't be information about what our situation has been since the dawn of democracy in terms of political party finances, which is really a necessary provision for research, for historians, for political analysts, for journalists, for members of the public to actually understand what does income look like for political parties. And going forward, once we've implemented this regulation, will we see a change in that income? Have these regulations had a positive or negative effect? That information can't be deduced without some kind of disclosure from parties about what their financial records have looked like up until now. And you can do so without actually disclosing donors, but simply disclosing some sort of financial record which would show spending and income and those sorts of things. So I think those are the 5 key points we wanted to raise. As I said, we've aligned ourselves with the My Vote Count submission, which has made an additional 5. But these are the key ones we want to emphasize. And of course, our A number of our submissions to the National Assembly are also still, I think they were included in the document pack, which give maybe some more detail to those as well. Chair, that was quick and easy from me, my 5 points. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hunter. Any clarity-seeking questions, honorable members? I have noted Honorable Monakedi, Honorable Mutlashupi, in that order. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. No, I just want to understand as to what will be the rationale for wanting to go back into history and demand in terms of the law that political parties must disclose whatever funding they have received in the past. I just want to understand what will be the rationale. But whether as well such a law will stand the test of legal scrutiny, because effectively you'll be saying the law will have to apply retrospectively. Thank you.
Thanks, Honorable Monakedi. Honorable Mutlashupi.
Chair, usually I don't ask questions, I make comments, just in passing. Members of society and communities by nature form companies, and companies are subjected to the Companies Act. And companies that are established do business with whoever. And therefore, Chairperson, it would not be a sin for members of society to donate whatever they would want to give to a political party. In terms of the submission here is that companies who do business with government should not be donating monies to political parties. I find it very strange because companies are made by individuals. Thank you.
Thanks, Honorable Mutlashupi. It looks like it was only one issue raised. The other one, it was a comment from Honorable Mutlashupi. So can you please respond to the issue raised by Honorable Monakedi? Thank you.
Chair, you must guide me. Is it possible to make a comment in response to a comment? Because I think that the member's raising a very important question that was not in the form of a question, it was in the form of a comment. But I think it is useful to clarify the purpose of the proposal to ban donations from companies doing business with the state. The question that needs to be answered by the committee is how can we address the risk of corruption when you have a donor to a political party that is also in business with the state that is run by that political party. Now, our proposal is that you can simply remove the possibility of that relationship existing. You can be a donor or you can do business with the state, but you can't be doing both because of the risk of corruption it creates. There may be other solutions to that problem, and I would be interested to hear what they would be, but for us it's a pretty clear fix for a pretty clear problem. And there is a history of incidents of corruption that have resulted from that, and we can discuss them if needs be. But I think the question that was asked about the rationale for a historical disclosure, I should clarify that we're not asking that the legislation would be retrospective. This is actually really a plea to the parties and to the committee to find some way, some mechanism of creating that historical record. And this could be an undertaking between parties. It could be a disclosure to the IEC. It could be a commitment that if a promotion of access to information request were made, that request would be honored rather than dragging it through a court process. We're not asking for the legislation to create that requirement, but the rationale would be several of them. The one is simply that it is important to complete the historical record, that there's a big piece of our politics over the course of a 20-year period of democracy that has actually essentially been shrouded in secrecy, that has only come out through particular incidents of investigative journalism and scandal. But actually, there's a much bigger story to be told about our democracy, about the lives of political parties over the last 20 years, which cannot currently be told because of this historical secrecy. That is the first, is the historical record. The second is that there has been a concern raised by several political parties that this regulation, whether it is, has good intentions or bad intentions, is potentially going to have unintended effects on multi-party democracy. For example, that smaller parties, I think the concern that was raised by the gentleman to my right, that smaller parties might suffer as a result of the regulation rather than be strengthened by the regulation. As it currently stands, we would have no way of knowing whether the regulation has its intended consequences or unintended consequences until we know, did donations go up or donations go down, or did income and spending stay the same? And that's why that information could also be of great use to Parliament and to the committee as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Honorable Labaskachny, I think you'll be the last one. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I actually asked this question now to this organization, but it's actually a question that was formulating in my mind in the past 3 presentations. We all agree that the putting this bill together is the right step in the right direction on a zero tolerance to corruption, especially with the perception in this country that we are very corrupt, that there are corrupt governments and corrupt individuals, because it goes to all that levels. Now, whether it goes into disclosure or non-disclosure, say for instance, we accept that everybody has to disclose in this bill on private funding to political parties. I'm not so sure, and I think this is one of the unintended consequences, that will prohibit the so-called corruption that we are aware of in state-owned companies, in tenders, in whatever, because people, organizations can disclose. The problem is we don't have, through this bill, the ability to monitor and disclose whatever is going on in other business processes in this country. So I can make a donation to a political party to the upper threshold, and everything is clean as whatever, and no one can point a finger at me. But in the meantime, this bill and this process for political funding will not be the vehicle for us to discover if the same company or the same person is involved in other processes in government or whatever the situation may be, in a private deal of money under the table and that kind of thing. So my question...
Point of order, Honorable Labaskachny.
My
Can you just pause? Let's give Honorable Dlamini. Is it a point of order, Honorable Member? Okay.
Chairperson, we are deep in discussions now. In fact, it started with the company itself when he was responding. It was more discussion than responses. Not she's out of order of what she's saying. I will suggest that we discuss these matters at the committee level when we debate everything. She's making input, valuable input, but maybe let's reserve that for the committee.
Can I make a ruling before there's going to be a proposal on top of another proposal, which will trigger another response? We take note of the input raised by Honorable Dlamini, suggestion that some of the issues necessarily will not be able to resolve them here. We'll deal with them. I think it's a point we made even earlier on at the level of the committee ourselves. But let's allow, because it was not a point of order which was raised, let's allow Honorable Labaskachny to continue, make your proposal, and then we take it from there. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to remind Honorable Dlamini that there's constant comments from this bank. Yeah, no, don't be disruptive, please. Respect the process. Thank you, Chair. In giving this, my understanding of this, my question is, would you, as the Right to Know and other organizations fighting for the zero tolerance of corruption in this country, not only according to this bill, because we will, as the chairperson said, look at the recommendations and take that into consideration, also keep continuing fighting in the same way that we're fighting for this bill for limiting corruption in other state departments? Because as it is not always, not even with the Auditor General's report and with all these things, to pick up these things. So the unintended consequences is we're going to a possibility of lessen the money for political parties to fulfill that role in society that we have to fulfill, to have a government, and not sure that we will stop the corruption by this process. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was important for you to conclude. I did not want to rush you, Honorable Labaskachni, but I could see that many people were starting to get irritated. But the only thing I'm asking, can we be tolerant to each other's views, please?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's why I'm saying I had to allow Honorable Labaskachni to make a proposal, make a comment, but also try to protect her in the process. And I think it applies to all of us, honorable members. Thank you, Honorable Labaskachni. Can we now give over to Mr. Hunter to respond, and then we move on? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. To the honourable member's point.
Honorable members, honorable members, can I please ask for tolerance amongst honorable members? Because I know some of the views will not necessarily sit very well with all of us. So let us be tolerant. Mr. Hunter, can I just give to the last member? Then when you respond to all the issues. Over to you, Ntate Shabangu.
Chairperson, before we can proceed, I think we must run this meeting professionally and treat people equally. Because you can see what is happening now. He's talking, I'm on the floor, you're saying nothing.
You are protected,
I'm not
Honorable
protected
Shabangu.
because you're quiet. KT is speaking, they're making noise. When they start fighting, it's then that you get in. No, Chairperson, you must treat us equally. And if you don't know that, people are watching what you're doing. You must not favor those that are in your party and treat others as if they are not members. Thank you.
Honorable Shabangu, I will just take that as a general statement because I'm not looking at members on the basis of political parties they come from. Myself, and for your own information, myself, Honorable Dlamini, were from the same party. She raised the point of order whilst Honorable Labaskachni was still on the floor. I did not rule in her favor because we are from the same party. I indicated that it's not a point of order, it's not sustained, and then the Honorable Member Labaskachni is protected. I think I'm fair.
Chair, you are not aware. At the end of the day, both Honorable Mutlashupi and Honorable Dlamini, they were exchanging words with Katie.
No, Honorable Shabangu, can I just request that we proceed? I will take the issue that you are raising, as part of the, progress-making proposals. So let's proceed in the interest of time. I don't think we are going to make actually progress if we can start to engage each other on the basis of political parties we come from and all of that. Let's allow Mr. Hunter to respond, and then we move to the next presentation. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Chair. The concern that's raised by the honourable member is obviously a serious one. I think none of us can be so naive as to believe that simply by implementing this bill we're going to deal with the illness of corruption in our country. And I want to absolutely say, yes, organizations like the Right to Know, like many of the others you've heard from, are steadfast in the fight against corruption, irrespective of what happens with this bill. So we're not pretending this is a total solution to the issue of corruption, but nor can we pretend that the issue of transparency is only about corruption. It's actually partly about corruption. It's actually about political equality, about ensuring that people with major checkbooks don't get to hide behind a veil of secrecy and pull the strings in our democratic politics without people whose only currency is a single X on a ballot. That's actually where we need to put power in people's hands. So if the concern is that we have a political climate in which there isn't freedom of association, in which people can't associate with a political party of their views openly, then we need to address the climate of intolerance. Then we need to address the issue that we don't have a climate of freedom of association. I don't think that we can address the cause of that illness with secrecy, which is actually about addressing a symptom. For us, I think that this is a much overdue step in the maturing of South African democracy to ensure that there is a level of transparency, to ensure voters do have the right to know. And there are going to be consequences, but we must address those consequences in a way that strengthens democracy. I don't think we're at a point where we can any longer hide behind the veil of secrecy and say, as a democracy, we're not mature enough for that, for transparency. In this era, I think we need to say this is a South African democracy that is mature enough to deal with these difficult truths, and we can do so transparently. So, yes, there will still be corruption once this bill is passed. Yes, we will still have to lean much more heavily on law enforcement agencies to prosecute that corruption in a way that they have failed to do so in many instances in the past. But it is unfortunately not acceptable for us to hide behind secrecy any further. So this is why we're putting our support behind the bill, if those changes that we've proposed are implemented. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Let's take this opportunity to thank you for coming through, Mr. Hunter, to come and present before the committee. It's really appreciated. You are now released, sir. Thank you. Honorable members, our next presentation will be done by Corruption Watch. I think there are two presenters, Ms. Lieni Govansami and then Ms. Michelle Setole. Over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, honourable members. Thank you for providing us with this opportunity to make our submissions on the bill. I'm here with my colleague, Michelle Setole. We are both from the Legal and Investigations team at Corruption Watch. The stated nature and purpose of the organization is in our submissions, but we're an NGO established in 2012, focused on anti-corruption work, particularly around policy. Our unit works on and litigation. We are also the Transparency International chapter in South Africa. And we're here today to highlight some aspects of our submission, but not all of them. We are really concerned, like I think other organizations have similarly expressed, about the risks that lack of transparency holds in respect of party funding. There are a number of issues that arise from companies, juristic entities, being able to fund political parties in a non-transparent manner, being able to influence particularly governing parties, whether on a national or provincial level, in the award of tenders, as well as in respect of policy choices that are being made by those governing parties. And our submissions reflect particularly those kinds of issues. We want to say that we regard the progress on the bill so far as being quite incredible, and we applaud the work that the ad hoc committee in the National Assembly and here is doing. We think, and I think we must state this at the outset, that a number of the issues that we raise today and that have been raised by other organizations relate to clarity and specifications around particular clauses. And so we don't necessarily think that these submissions should result in an amendment to the bill itself, but it could also be dealt with in regulation. So we support that this bill be passed as quickly as possible, so as to enable the implementation, enforcement of particularly the disclosure provisions, and that some of the issues that we raise be dealt with in regulation. I think that it could be a way of ensuring that this process is fast-tracked. So on to the provisions themselves. I think we'll start off by looking at the definition of donations in kind. We think that this needs to be better regulated to avoid any kind of abuse, particularly around the nature and type of donations in kind that are being made. Perhaps looking at where donations in kind are pro bono legal services or accounting services, and where possible, if those donations in kind can have some sort of monetary value attached to it. So even if they are provided for free, where there's a monetary value that can be estimated, we think that that could be a way of preventing some sort of abuse there, or preventing or allowing people, the public CSOs, to see what companies have donated and whether that has resulted in any influence of any kind, to the extent that that's possible. In terms of the prohibition on certain donations, look, we welcome the prohibitions. We think that they are necessary. In our previous round of submissions, on which we based our submissions on the OECD framework on financing democracy, these prohibitions were particularly recommended, and we're glad to see them here. We would want to still highlight the issues around donations to political parties from companies here, so local companies, trusts, individuals, investment vehicles. So companies would, or juristic entities would include investment vehicles that are either owned or partially owned by political parties. We think that there's still significant scope for abuse in respect of these companies, like we mentioned earlier, donating amounts of money in order to influence either tender outcomes or influence policy choices. What's important to note here is that what this is about, it's about knowing who owns those companies. So it's about beneficial ownership information or shareholding information. If we are not in a position to know, so even if a company discloses that they've made a particular donation, or if you're not privy to that information, you're still going to need the beneficial ownership information in order to properly check that and properly check who's behind those companies. I think trust could be similarly abused in that way. So it's important if we are enabling the public, the media, civil society to interrogate information, to give them all the necessary information to do that. So where possible, we would like regulations to provide some specificity, to provide more clarity on the type of information that is being provided. On the issue of donations from foreign entities, and this is for training and skills development, policy development, we had seen this as a bit of an odd provision, but again, perhaps it is about clarity. We think that donations of this nature is something that you would have wanted to prevent in terms of foreign entities affecting, influencing our policies or a governing party's policy. And perhaps this needs to be specified or clarified through the regulation. And this is really in order to prevent what the OECD guidelines says is policy capture. So where you have foreign entities, governments trying to capture the policy of another nation. Then when we're looking at clause 9.3, which deals about the disclosures or the commission publishing disclosures on a quarterly basis, it's a bit unclear as to where that publication is taking place. Is it a publication that is by the Commission to Parliament, and does it stop there? Is this a publication that is public in the sense that it's placed on a website for public consumption? We think that this needs to be clarified. And if it is for public consumption, what is really important, and again drawing from the OECD framework, is that the publication of these reports should be timely, reliable, accessible, intelligible, and really there in order to promote media, civil society oversight and scrutiny. And finally, one of the final points is around supporting what National Treasury has said in their submissions around the funds appropriated for political parties by provincial legislatures. We understand National Treasury to be saying that those amounts that are appropriated by provincial legislatures often exceed the amounts that are transferred in the national sphere, and that public funding of political parties at a provincial level, at even a provincial level, should be regulated in terms of the current bill or the regulations to the bill. So we would support that view. So I think that we really did want to keep our submissions quite short, as they are in the written submissions and are further elaborated on in the submissions we made before the National Assembly, which are available to you. At the end of the day, I think we really do need to emphasize that we would want the bill passed as quickly as possible in order to enable, at the very least, the provisions around disclosure to come into place. We understand the difficulties that the IEC is facing in terms of funding, but I don't think, or we don't think as Corruption Watch, that those difficulties would be faced around the disclosure provisions, because they would not take a lot in order to ensure that the information that is provided to the IEC is published on certain platforms. And we think that where possible, the issues that have been raised by organizations should be dealt with in terms of the regulations, which can be further debated from if there are changes. Thank you. Michelle and I will field questions.
No, thank you very much for the presentation. Honorable members, there's the presentation. Let's engage it. Any clarity-seeking question from the presentation itself? I'm not inviting any political statements this time around, honorable members. I'm going to be very strict. Only clarity-seeking questions. If you've got a political comment or statement to make, can you please reserve that airtime for next week, when we'll be meeting as a committee for deliberations? Then you can put through or forward your party position and all of that. Honorable Dlamini, is your hand up, or are you fine? Oh, okay. Now let me give you space to pray. Thank you. It looks like the presentation was straightforward, and the honorable members, understood it very clearly. So there's no questions for clarity. So you are excused. Thanks for the presentation. And then the last presentation, honorable members, will be from the Economic Freedom Fighters, which will be done by Mr. Kwena Manamela. That's the EFF. We can come forward, my brother. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Manamela. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson, honorable members. Good afternoon. My name is Kwena Manamela. I am the National Head of Legal for the Economic Freedom Fighters. And these are our submissions. I will try to be very brief. I know that a bundle has just been circulated, and as you can see, it's very brief. At the outset, I would like to begin by stating and making it very clear that the EFF has at all material times been at the forefront of championing for a law that will regulate political party funding. To that end, I would like to refer the House or remind the House of a statement that was published by our national spokesperson, Mr. Quinton Mbuyiseni-Ndlozi, or rather Dr. Quinton Mbuyiseni-Ndlozi, when he stated that the EFF is the first political party to openly campaign that a law must be passed forcing political parties to reveal who their funders are. As the bill stands right now, the economic freedom fighters is opposed to supporting it. This is as the bill stands. Now, our grounds for opposing the bill is twofold, or it's based on two grounds. It is, number one, Section 10 of the bill as it is. Number two, it will be Schedule 2, Regulations 2, Regulation 3, and Regulation 4 of the bill. Chairperson, if I may, just briefly and quickly. Section 10(1) reads as follows: no person or entity may deliver a donation to a member of the political party other than for political purposes. Subsection 2, a member of the political party may only receive a donation contemplated in subsection 1 on behalf of the party. Subsection 3 of Section 10, no person may circumvent subsections 1 and 2. And then we move over back to Section 1 of the bill, Chairperson. It defines a donation, and under paragraph A of donation, it says donation includes a donation in kind. And then when defining a donation in kind under paragraph A, subparagraph 1, 2, 3, and 4, it says money lent to a political party, any money paid on behalf of a political party, and so on and so forth. Chairperson, Section 10 is too broad. It's just too broad, and we cannot support it as it stands. When you read the bill, it states that no person or entity may deliver a donation. That's very broad. What in essence it does, it borderline infringes upon the right to freedom of association as entrenched in the Constitution. It is subject to gross misinterpretation as it stands, in the sense that it will also deter members of the public from joining political parties out of fear of losing out on their donations. It is prohibitory in nature. And the way it stands, it would, for an example, Chairperson, Kwena Manamela, in his capacity as a beneficiary of a deceased estate, receives a donation from that particular deceased estate, or is bequeathed a donation in terms of a will. The reading of Section 10 then says that, that cannot happen. The reading of Section 10 then says that you cannot receive that donation unless that donation is for political purposes. Now, if I am sitting at home as a voter, and I suddenly hear about this bill, and then, wait a minute, if I receive a donation, it must be for political purposes. Well, let me rather not affiliate myself with any political party. Chairperson, I'll refer you to a Constitutional Court judgment, which essentially pronounces upon Section 36 of the Constitution. Section 36, 1 of the Constitution reads as follows. I'll just be brief. The rights of the Bill of Rights may be limited only in terms of a law of general application to the extent that the limitation is reasonable and justifiable. And then it states that the relevant factors for determining reasonable and justifiable limitation of a particular right would include the nature of the right, the importance and purpose of the limitation, the nature and extent of the limitation, and the relation between the limitation itself and the right. We should not be seen to pass a law that will limit the rights of people to exchange donations with one another, unless if it's only for political purposes. And that's how Section 10 currently reads. We as the EFF then submit that the wording of Section 10 should at least be amended to read as follows, to say that no person or entity may deliver a donation intended to a political party to a member of that political party other than for political purposes. And then we also submit that we need to elaborate further on the definitions of a donation, because they're also too broad and subject to misinterpretation. Those are our submissions insofar as Section 10 is concerned. Insofar as regulations 2 and 3 and 4 are concerned, Chairperson, we submit that the proportional allocation formula is totally prejudicial to small parties, in the sense that if the spirit and purpose of the bill is to ensure multi-party democracy, why then should we have such an imbalanced allocation of these particular funds? Chairperson, we submit that it should be an equal allocation, 50-50, Chairperson. Those are the brief submissions of the economic freedom fighters, and we will take questions and so forth as that is concerned.
No, thank you very much, Ntate Manamela, for the presentation. I will invite hands for members if there's any clarity seeking. There's the proposal from the EFF, 50-50 split and no proportionality and so forth. So I'll invite hands. I've got Honorable Munakedi, Honorable Dlamini, Honorable Shabangu, and then Honorable. Okay, let's move in this order, honorable members. Honorable Munakedi, Honorable Dlamini, Honorable Mutlashupin. In that order, honorable members.
Thanks very much, Chair. Yeah, I think obviously some of the issues needs to be ventilated in our own committee, not at this level, where we are receiving presentations from interested stakeholders, including the EFF, obviously as a political party. But with regard to his, their submission, their proposal around, I think, Section 10, I just want to get the understanding. Yeah, clearly, because my understanding, my own understanding is that this bill is based on the Constitution, on what is there in the Constitution, no? As we quoted or referred to it earlier on, section or clause 236 of the Constitution, which refers to represented political parties in the legislature and parliament or national legislature. And as you are aware, the electoral arrangement laws in South Africa is that when we vote for political parties, not individuals. So that is why in the bill it can be allowed that an individual should actually get a donation, unless that individual will be receiving that donation on behalf of a party. Until such time that we amend those laws whereby we will then have constituency-based elections, there's no way we can then provide for such in the bill, you know, that individual can. If an individual wants to receive a donation, it must be on behalf of the party, and it means he must be part as a supporter or as a member of a party. So I just want you to rethink, you know, I think what we have just presented as far as especially this clause is concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Honorable Dlamini.
Thank you very much, Chair. Honorable Chair, let me welcome the presentation. Just one question. Chair, you roll me out of order if I'm out of order. But it's a genuine question that I hear the inputs made by the party, which one will take them as serious as inputs made by other organizations. But how is this objection different from all the objections they are making in everything that is done? just that question. How is it different, this objection? Is it a genuine objection or is it an objection because a bill is initiated by the ANC? I would want to take these things serious, but you see, my challenge is that they've been objecting everything. How is this one different? So that when I apply my mind, taking what he has been presenting, I know that this one is genuine.
Thank you, Honorable Mutlashuping.
Covered by the interpretation that was brought by Honorable Monakedi on Section 10 of the interpretation of Section 10. But let me not raise the committee's.
No, thank you. Those are the issues in the Demonamel. Can you please respond?
All right then.
I think it's two issues. The other one, please take it as a comment. But if you want to clarify or respond to it, just respond.
All right then. Thank you, Chairperson. The first issue, Honorable Member, if you go to Section 10, particularly Clause 2, right? I'm going to read it to you as it is. A member of a political party may only receive a donation contemplated in subsection 1 on behalf of the party. A 78-year-old member of a political party may only receive a donation if it's intended for political purposes. It cannot be, what I'm saying, that's why I'm saying it's too broad. I understand the fact that it was not the intention of the legislature to make it so broad. It might be oversight, it might have been an error, but the way you read it, an ordinary member of the public or any other entity leader will read this to say that I, in my personal capacity, cannot receive a donation unless if this particular donation will be utilized for the realization of political party objectives. This is how Section 10 reads. I am not speculating, it's how it reads. It says that. So our submission is to say that let us be specific. Let us not be too broad in just saying a donation received by a political member. Am I clear enough? Thank you. Okay, thank you. And the second comment, it's a genuine objection, madam. It's a genuine objection in the sense that should this bill be passed as it is, we intend to refer it to court to be declared unconstitutional. That's how genuine this objection is. Should this bill be passed with Section 10 reading as it reads, the economic freedom fighters will take this to court to be declared unconstitutional. That is how genuine this objection is. Like all other objections, we do not just object for the sake of objecting. Thank you.
No, the last part, the last part of your response, I don't want to take it as a threat.
It is definitely not.
Yeah, I would like to take it as part of your, the issues
it's
that
actually
you are,
part of the presentation.
You are actually clarifying the committee. Yes.
Oh, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's fine. I think we take note of the issues that you are putting forward. I mean, the party position, where do you stand, where are your discomfort, which areas you are actually objecting to the bill and so forth. I think we take note of that. I will just give the last round to honorable members and then we conclude on it. Honorable Mwita.
Thanks, Chair. Chair, I want to reiterate that the bill that we are dealing with here and now, it's a bill that is focused on political funding. So I do not want us to confuse this bill with other legislations as if we are regulating individuals. Let me put it in that sense. We are more focused on political funding. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Ndate Monakedi, it looks like you are.
I'm confident that the chairperson of EFF That Mpofu will advise them correctly going
Okay.
forward. Yeah.
No, thank you, thank you. Do you want to respond, or are you comfortable, or you want to say something before we conclude?
So far, nothing warrants a response.
Okay. No, thank you very much. Ntate Manamela, thanks for the presentation from the EFF. We really appreciate you coming through to make those proposals and then putting forward your party position. It's really appreciated. You are actually excused, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson.
All right. Honorable members, that was the last presentation from the EFF. So that was actually the last presentation from the EFF. But before we conclude, honorable members, I think I just need to mention one or two issues, brief issues. We are scheduled to meet as a committee next week, Wednesday, based on our program of the NCOP. Now, next week, Wednesday, has been allocated now to the ad hoc on the Northwest intervention, and it's going to take place the whole day. So, which is going to have an impact on our work as a committee, because it means there's going to be a clash between the two ad hoc committees. Now, I actually wanted to put forward a proposal that says we must actually try to shift our meeting for Tuesday, and then because Tuesday also there's a sitting on the celebration of the legacy of Mandela and Sisulu. There will be a debate in the NCOP, maybe until 5 or 6. So I was going to propose to the committee that maybe we must look at meeting it in the evening because we don't have time. Maybe Tuesday evening, 6 o'clock, until 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. If that will be fine with honorable members. If honorable members feels no, there's going to be a problem, we go in terms of the program, like the committee secretary now was communicating with the office of the House Chairperson, Nyambi of committees, to request that change to accommodate us for next week. Therefore, if we're not going to agree on it, it means we're going to have a problem for next week. And then if we don't meet on Wednesday, the implication is that it's going to have an impact on our 6 weeks program, which we set ourselves for as a committee. If we miss the meeting next week, Wednesday, we don't meet the whole of next week. It means we'll only be able to convene after recess. So which will be a problem. So I want us to agree on it. So I'll invite honorable members to make comments, proposals, and then let's see if we are not able to meet each other on that one. The proposal that is workable, we looked at it either Wednesday evening after the ad hoc of Northwest. Wednesday evening, 6 o'clock, or either Tuesday evening, 6 o'clock. But it must be in the evening. There's no way in the program where we are going to be accommodated for the whole of next week. So I'm putting it to you, honorable members. Okay, let's have an opportunity for all members in that order to maybe express a view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chair, when we started the process, we committed ourselves as members of the committee that we would be flexible in terms of times, dates and time schedules for our meetings. So I am reiterating that point, that we agree with the proposal as of now. If there are any hiccups that the Chair picks up, you will then communicate to us, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Honorable Munakeri. Honorable, I want you to say something, Honorable Dlamini. I'm insisting that you must say something. Over to you.
No, thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Given the schedule of the NCOP, and also taking note that this is not the only committee, committees are still sitting, I will support the Tuesday evening.
Thank you. Honorable Mutlashuping.
I second the proposal that we have made from the Chair, and it is on the basis that the majority of the members who serve also on this committee are also members in the intervention. So looking at that, The practicality is that we have requested that we will, as Honorable Ngita said, will be flexible enough. And I think the majority of the people agrees that the meeting of Tuesday must continue.
No, thank you, Honorable Labuskaghni, and then Honorable Chabangu will be the last one.
Thank you, Chair. I am aware of the fact that we made a commitment for the program as being proposed on the, as is for Wednesday. I understand that we have a problem with that. Unfortunately, at this stage, I cannot meet on Tuesday evening because I do have other commitments as well, and I have a meeting that I can't postpone. So I would support the meeting on Wednesday, and I know it's going to be hard on some of the members here. Other than that, I would like to just remind the members that we can ask for an extension. This is a rule, and select committees all over, right through this 4 years, ask for extensions for the period of 6 weeks. So there's no reason that if we can't find the time to do quality work, and not in the end of the day when we are tired and we're going to be rushed through everything, and we are going to say you talk too long because we want to get home and there's no buses and all that kind of things, because I've been in meetings like that. It's a rushed job. Then I would rather ask that it be postponed to the first week after we come back from the constituency week time.
Honorable Chabangu, you are the last one.
Chair, I think we must follow a policy of majority rule. This, I'll call him her a woman. She's disturbing me. I think we must follow a policy of majority rule, taking into account that after next week, there is a committee that is going to go all over South Africa telling people about the expropriation of land without compensation. And I'm serving in that committee, and Dr. Mhlashuping is also a member, and then we'll never have any other time. Thank you.
No, thank you, honorable members. I think it goes without saying. I didn't want to put it like Honorable Chabangu is putting it. I wanted to put it in a more lighter pronouncement and say, in as much as we can see that many people agree, the majority, but our responsibility is to reach out to most of the members and to show them that this is not possible, let's do it in this fashion. But sometimes, again, it's also not possible. And then, honorable members, so we are actually agreeing on the meeting of Tuesday evening. So we'll make that request to the House Chairperson, and then for 6 o'clock in the evening of Tuesday. So let me thank everybody that came through to make, oral presentations to the committee, members of the media, members of the community, and then the critical stakeholders that set aside time to come today, and then also including ourselves, honorable members. It shows commitment from our part as members of parliament that we are dedicated to do the work. We are always not rushing. We want to do quality work and so forth. So on that note, honorable members, thank you very much for coming through. The meeting stands adjourned. Thank you. Honorable members, there's a finger supper here. Finger, Mutashuping.
And maybe just remind members that the transport is leaving at 6:15 to the villages. At 6:15, the transport has been arranged.
Okay. Honorable members, transport is leaving at 6:15 to the villages. Ne? Thank you.